The Lemon Orchard. Just after 3:30 a.m., on the morning of Sunday, March 11th, 1979, a police dispatcher in Oxnard, California, received a frantic phone call. The caller said that his name was Enrique Zuniga and that he was calling from out of state. According to Zuniga, his ex-wife, Alma, had called him from a payphone in Oxnard. They had been talking on the phone when Alma suddenly said, "That guy came back." Before he could ask which guy she was talking about, he heard the phone booth door open. Then Alma started screaming that someone was hitting her. Then he heard the door close again, and there was only silence on the line. Zuniga didn't know the location of the phone booth, but begged the dispatcher to find Alma. "She's been raped before," he pleaded. "This can't happen again." These days, we take 911 for granted. But back in 1979, the 911 emergency system did not exist in California. It was still 4 years away. The dispatcher therefore forwarded the call to the city of Oxnard's after-hours line. From there, patrol officers were informed of a possible abduction. A unit soon located a payphone on J Street with the receiver hanging off the hook. But they found no trace of the missing woman or of her car, described as a rusty blue Pontiac. They would not locate Alma Zuniga that night. At around 10 a.m. the next morning, another distraught man was on the line to the Oxnard police. His name was Jesus Gutierrez, and he had a disturbing find to report. According to Gutierrez, he'd been driving home with his family from church when he'd spotted a human hand protruding from the dirt on the lemon orchard where he lived. The site was in El Rio, a small semi-rural community on the outskirts of Oxnard. Officers immediately rushed to the scene. There, they found the sight that had so distressed Jesus Gutierrez, a slim hand reaching through the layer of dirt as though trying to escape the makeshift grave. The burial site was about 83 feet from North Rose Avenue. Carefully evacuated, it turned out to contain the body of a petite, dark-haired woman. Whoever had buried her here had done so in a hurry, evacuating a shallow grave, and then pulling a rusty bed spring and part of an old corrugated water tank over it. The victim's bra, blouse, and jacket were pulled up to expose her breasts. She was naked from the waist down, with her pants buried beside her and her underwear placed on top of the water tank. The police found a purse containing nearly $100 in cash. There was also a dry cleaning receipt made out in the victim's name. Alma Zuniga had been found. Other evidence found at the crime scene included 2 .22 caliber casings and 1 unexpended round. The casings were from 2 bullets that had been fired into Alma's head. One had buried itself in her right temple. The other had shattered her jaw. In addition, the young woman had been stabbed. A long-bladed knife had been thrust into her lower back, slicing through flesh and perforating her liver. Since this was obviously a sex crime, a rape kit was prepared and retrieved a semen sample. Back in 1979, this was not the game-changer that it is today. All that it told investigators was the blood type of the killer. But how had Alma Zuniga ended up here, in a shallow grave on the outskirts of town? Tracking her movements, investigators learned that she'd been out clubbing the previous evening with a couple of friends named Christine Oregon and Sergio Valdez. The trio had worked their way through the night spots of downtown Oxnard and had eventually ended up at the Army-Navy Cafe on 5th Street. That was around 2 a.m., and they'd stayed for an hour before eventually calling it a night. Christine and Sergio had walked Alma to her car. They'd watched her drive away and turn left onto Oxnard Boulevard at its intersection with 5th Street. A short time later, Alma had made the fateful decision to call her ex-husband and had stopped at a payphone. It was here that her killer found her and dragged her from the phone booth. He'd then forced her into her car and driven away with her. How had he subdued Alma, a woman known for her feisty temperament? That question would be answered when the police found the missing Pontiac. The passenger seat was thick with congealed blood. Now, investigators understood that terrible knife wound to Alma's lower back. It appeared that the killer had stabbed her here, in the car. This was a deep, debilitating wound, potentially fatal. After that, there would have been no fight left in her. The killer had driven her to the lemon orchard and pulled her from the vehicle. He'd raped her on the ground as she lay dying. Then, after taking what he wanted, he callously executed the 23-year-old, making an orphan of her 18-month-old son. This theory was validated when the police canvassed the area around the lemon orchard, looking for potential witnesses. Bonnie Winters lived next to the property on Simon Way. She reported hearing a car idling in the dark after 3 a.m. Sometime later, she heard 2 loud pops, one following the other in quick succession. However, she didn't recognize them as gunshots and went back to bed. The police now knew what had happened to Alma Zuniga. What they didn't know was who was responsible. Over the days that followed, detectives Ricardo Rodriguez and Marty McCoy spoke to Alma's relatives, some of whom seemed to believe that her ex-husband was involved in her death. They also spoke to friends and neighbors, trying to get a handle on the young woman's life. That was how they learned that Alma had worked on and off as a prostitute, and that she sometimes boasted about robbing her Johns. So was that what had happened? Had one of these duped men tracked her down and had his revenge? It seemed like a promising line of inquiry, but ultimately it led nowhere. So too did every other clue and suspect that the investigators looked into. Ultimately, the leads ran dry and the case went cold. Over a quarter-century later, in September 2004, the Ventura County District Attorney's Office received a call from a lawyer who said that he had a client with information on a murder. According to the lawyer, the crime had happened in Oxnard in the late 70s and involved the killing of a prostitute who'd ended up buried in a shallow grave in El Rio. His client wanted to strike a deal for a friend, he said, if the DA was prepared to listen. Such deals, of course, are commonplace within the justice system, and the authorities are always willing to negotiate if it will clear up a case and put a killer behind bars. Unfortunately, in this instance, the DA heard no more from the informant. That left investigator Scott Peterson with a puzzle to solve. Which murder had he been referring to? Going through the files from the era, Peterson eventually whittled it down to just one: the brutal slaying of Alma Zuniga. Peterson also noted that semen had been collected in the case, which made it potentially solvable. He immediately asked for the sample to be sent to the Sheriff's Department's Forensic Sciences Laboratory. The result was a single-source male DNA profile. Entered into CODIS, it returned a match to a man named John Clark Russell. Russell was well known to the authorities. He was a habitual criminal with an arrest record that went back to his teens. Much of his youth had been spent in juvenile correctional facilities, and adulthood in no way mellowed him. He quickly graduated to more serious crimes. In 1973, he was arrested for snatching a 19-year-old woman from an Oxnard street and forcing her into his car. The trial ended in a hung jury, and Russell later pleaded down to a misdemeanor. That was only a brief respite, though. He'd be in and out of prison over the years that followed. His career would also continue unabated after the murder of Alma Zuniga. In December 1979, just a few months after Alma was killed, Russell crept up on a couple sitting in a parked car at Mandalay Beach and fired into their vehicle. Both of the victims were hit, but both survived. Russell was convicted of assault with intent to commit murder and sentenced to 13 years in prison. He served just 6. In 2002, he was arrested in Kern County in connection with a stalking incident. It was at that time that he was required to submit a DNA sample. Now, 6 years later, that sample had found a match. However, it would be a long 4 years before the authorities were eventually ready to bring Russell in. Those years were not wasted. They were spent refining the DNA evidence. The initial identification had been made using a DNA kit known as an identifiler, but it was low in quality, and the DA feared that it might be challenged by the defense at trial. The sample was subsequently sent to Sorensen Forensics, a private laboratory in Utah and a world leader in forensic testing. Here, a far more sensitive test was carried out using the mini-filer kit. The result it delivered was indisputable. On July 26, 2012, detectives tracked John Russell to a Bakersfield gym and arrested him as he left the premises. Interviewed at the Ventura County Jail, Russell was indignant about the charges against him. He flatly denied knowing Alma Zuniga or having anything to do with her death. Even the revelation that his DNA had been found on the victim's body would not shift him from his denials. "I never seen this woman before," he said. "Never met this woman before. Never buried her in some shallow grave before. Never took her from J Street." "How do you know that she was taken from J Street?" one of the interrogators responded. "We never said where she was taken from." Russell had slipped up here, mentioning something that had not been reported in the media, something that only the killer would know. However, he recovered quickly, relying on a tactic often employed by criminals. He accused the police of putting words in his mouth and trying to set him up. He also repeated his assertion that it wasn't his DNA that had been found on the murdered woman. And Russell would carry this denial into his murder trial. Right from the start, his lawyer, public defender Bartley Brown, attacked the DNA evidence, calling it low-grade and decrepit. Unfortunately for Brown, and for his client, that simply wasn't true. The mini-filer was the most advanced DNA technology on Earth, and Sorensen Forensics was the world leader in applying it. The extra time taken by the DA's office had paid dividends. Far from being decrepit, the results were unquestionable. In the end, the jury was left with a relatively easy deliberation. John Clark Russell was found guilty of first-degree murder with special circumstances that it had been committed during a kidnapping and rape. He was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole. Jamie Zuniga had been just 18 months old when his mother was murdered. He was 37 years of age when he saw her killer brought to justice. His dad, Enrique, who'd phoned in that desperate call on the morning of March 11th, 1979, hadn't lived to see justice done. He died a year before Russell was arrested. But before he passed, Enrique had told his son about his mom's murder. He'd been highly emotional when relating the story. Even after all the years that had passed, it was still raw. It still hurt. Now that he finally had closure, Jamie wanted to honor both of his parents. On the day after the trial, Jamie drove out to the lemon orchard where his mother's life had been so brutally ended. He had brought a dozen red roses with him, and he placed these, 10 feet apart, around the area where Alma had been found. Then he closed his eyes and said a silent prayer. For one of the relatives who had accompanied him on this pilgrimage, it was all too much. "It's okay," Jamie said, taking his weeping aunt in his arms. "It's going to be okay." Little boy lost. It is the kind of situation to melt even the hardest of hearts, a desperate, tearful mother crying for a missing child. The date was Saturday, May 25th, 1991, and the mother in question was 23-year-old Michelle Ladzinski. The child was 5-year-old Timmy. According to Michelle, she'd brought the boy to Kennedy Park in Sayreville, New Jersey, for the South Amboy Elks Club Carnival. She'd left him queuing for a ride while she went to buy a soda. When she returned, Just minutes later, he was gone. A desperate search had turned up no sign of him, and that was when she'd asked the fairground staff to call the police. To the officers who responded to the scene, this was a dire situation with not a moment to lose. They immediately called in reinforcements and started a search. That effort was quickly expanded to include tracking dogs, firefighters, and dozens of civilian volunteers. Together, they explored every inch of the carnival grounds and then expanded out into the surrounding areas. They found no trace of the little boy. Timmy was gone. It was as though he'd been spirited away by dark magic. But this was no conjuring trick. The police were firmly of the opinion that the boy had been abducted. Initially, they suspected that his father might be involved. But George Wiltse lived 1,000 miles away in Iowa and had not left home over the holiday weekend. He'd also never been involved in his son's life, so had no real motive. He was quickly eliminated as a suspect. That left a more terrifying prospect, the possibility that Timmy had been abducted by a pedophile. Except that no one in the vicinity had seen anything untoward. In fact, no one seems to have seen Timmy at all. And that was odd. According to Michelle, he'd been dressed in a bright red outfit, something that would surely have stood out. A week passed without any trace of the missing boy. In the meantime, detectives had obtained a statement from his mother. According to Michelle Ledzinski, she and Timmy had spent time at Holmdel Park that afternoon before driving to the carnival in the early evening. Officers then went to question the park police and picked up an anomaly. The lot where Michelle claimed to have parked her car had been closed that day. Michelle was then called in to clear up the misunderstanding and soon broke down, admitting that she had lied about Timmy's disappearance. Timmy hadn't gone missing at the fair. He'd been taken at knife point by 2 men. She hadn't reported this earlier because the men had threatened to kill her if she said anything. It was after listening to this barely believable story that the police first started to seriously consider Michelle Ledzinski as a suspect in her son's disappearance. But Michelle had more tall tales where that one came from. The very next day, she was back at the police station with an embellishment. She now claimed that the men who took Timmy were working for a woman named Ellen, who was employed as a dancer at a local strip club. She couldn't explain why Ellen would have wanted to kidnap her son, but insisted that it was she who was responsible. Asked how she knew Ellen, Michelle said that she was a customer at the bank where Michelle worked. The police then started making inquiries, trying to track down the dancer. They found no evidence that she was a real person. Finally, they asked Michelle Ledzinski to take a polygraph. She failed, twice. 6 months passed, during which time the police found no trace of Timmy Wiltse, neither dead nor alive. The case, meanwhile, was featured on America's Most Wanted, and Timmy's face became ubiquitous in New Jersey, appearing everywhere on missing person posters and on milk cartons. Then, on October 26, 1991, there seemed to be a break in the case. A schoolteacher named Dan O'Malley was bird-watching in an area of marshland close to the Raritan Center Business Park in Edison, New Jersey, when he found a child's sneaker. O'Malley recognized the shoe immediately. It was branded with the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and had been highly publicized in connection with Timmy Wiltse's disappearance. It was the exact shoe Timmy had been wearing on the day he went missing. It was also his size. However, when the sneaker was shown to Michelle, she immediately stated that it was not her son's. The shoe was later sent to an FBI lab for testing, but the results were inconclusive. With Michelle still insisting that it did not belong to Timmy, the shoe looked like a dead end. But then, the police learned that Michelle had a connection to the location where the shoe was found. She had once worked at the Raritan Center complex and had been fond of walking through the surrounding parkland during her lunch breaks. This was exactly where her son's sneaker had turned up. Coincidence? Perhaps. But why, then, had Michelle omitted the Raritan Center job from the employment history she'd provided to the police? Was it possible that she was hiding something? On April 23, 1992, law officers launched a major search of the area where the sneaker had been found. They soon found the matching shoe. Then, on the second day of the search, they found the partial skeletal remains of a child near Red Root Creek. Timmy Wiltsey was identified through dental records. The mystery of Timmy's whereabouts had finally been resolved. However, another riddle still needed to be unraveled. How had the child ended up dead and in the locale where he'd been found? Investigators had their suspicions, but nothing to back them up. The corpse was too badly decomposed to determine cause of death, and there were few other clues. The police did find a full-sized blue blanket close to the body. This was bagged up and tagged as evidence. Over the months that followed, Michelle Ledzinski remained under investigation by local law enforcement and by the FBI. On January 21, 1994, her car was discovered idling outside her New Jersey home, with Michelle nowhere to be found. The following day, she turned up in Detroit, Michigan, claiming that she'd been abducted by FBI agents. According to Michelle, the feds had told her that they were teaching her a lesson for talking about Timmy. 2 weeks later, she doubled down on her allegations, claiming that an FBI business card had been left on her front door. Scrawled on the card was the message, "It's not over." Further investigation revealed that she'd had the card printed herself at a local print shop. The hoax would see her convicted and sentenced to 6 months house arrest. Neither was this the last of Michelle's trouble with the law. In 1997, pregnant with her second child, she was convicted of stealing a computer from her employer and was placed on probation. A year later, she moved to Florida, and a year after that to Minnesota. She married in 2001, but the union didn't last. In 2003, now pregnant with her third child, she returned to Florida, settling in Port St. Lucie. Timmy, 12 years dead by this time, seemed to be long forgotten. But not everyone had given up on finding justice for the murdered boy. Back in New Jersey, the police remained committed to closing the case. It frequently came up in cold case reviews, only to be relegated to the back of the queue when it became obvious that the case was a gamble. There was no DNA or other forensic evidence. This was a purely circumstantial case, the riskiest kind to put in front of a jury. In 2011, prosecutors eventually decided to chance it. The evidence they would rely on wasn't new. It all came down to that blanket that had been found at the crime scene. Michelle Ledzinski denied that it was hers, but 3 of Timmy's former babysitters said otherwise. The blanket was distinctive. They recognized it from the Ledzinski household. The question was, how had it ended up at the crime scene? Certainly, Timmy would not have been carrying it around, not on a day when the temperature was in the early 90s. And if he hadn't brought it from the house, who then? It could only have been his mother. To what purpose? That was left open-ended, although the implication was clear. It was to conceal something. A child's corpse, perhaps. According to the prosecution theory, Ledzinski had murdered her son at home, then wrapped him in the blanket and driven him to the dump site, in an area she knew well. The fact that she'd lied so often to the police strengthened the prosecution case. But there was still the question of motive to be resolved. Why would a young mother murder her only son, her firstborn, her own flesh and blood? It turned out that Michelle was the worst possible kind of mother, the kind who resents the responsibility of raising a child. Timmy had medical problems and suffered frequent stomach ailments and problems with his teeth. Michelle hated the extra care that he required. She frequently lost her temper with the boy. On more than one occasion, she was heard to comment, "I'm not made for this shit," when having to deal with the responsibilities of motherhood. Michelle also had a boyfriend, Fred Bruno, who disliked Timmy. Certainly, the child appeared terrified of Bruno. According to those who were present, she showed barely any emotion at Timmy's funeral. Just a few days after burying her son, she flew to the Bahamas for a vacation with Bruno. August 6, 2014, would have been Timmy Wiltsey's 29th birthday. It was also the day that his mother was arrested and charged with his murder. Her murder trial began on March 16, 2016, and ended 2 months later with a unanimous guilty verdict. She was sentenced to 30 years in prison with no possibility of parole. Queen of Hearts. It was a unique idea, first used by the U.S. military during the Iraq conflict. Packs of playing cards were issued to the troops, each of them featuring a picture of a wanted Iraqi war criminal. Saddam Hussein was the ace of spades, while his ministers, generals, and top aides appeared in a hierarchical structure, distributed over the 4 suits. The idea was to keep their faces top of mind, and it was wildly successful. All but 4 of the individuals featured in that original 52-card deck were either killed or captured. In 2005, law enforcement officials in Florida were inspired by this idea and decided to put it to a different use. The playing cards they commissioned featured the faces of homicide victims and missing persons. Thousands of these packs were manufactured, then distributed to prisons across the state, where they were sold for $1.75 a deck. The front of each card contained a photograph. The back contained a brief description of the crime. The idea was to jog the memory of anyone who might know something, anything, about the case. And it worked. Soon, tips were pouring in, many of them useless, but others that led to arrests and convictions. In fact, the scheme was so successful that other states began to take notice. Soon, these unique playing cards were showing up in correctional facilities across the nation. In 2008, the state of Washington piloted the scheme. In March 2010, someone called in a tip on the Queen of Hearts, a young homicide victim named Susan Schwartz. Susan Schwartz was just 24 years old when she was shot to death in her Linwood, Washington home on October 22, 1979. The young woman had been killed by an intruder who dragged her from the shower, tied her hands, and then executed her with 2 bullets to the head. The killer then ransacked the apartment, leaving with several items, but the crime made little sense to investigators. Burglars are seldom violent unless confronted. In this case, the victim was restrained, so why kill her? Washington is a death penalty state. Why risk it? To investigators, there were only 2 possible answers to these questions. The first was that Susan knew her killer and had been murdered to prevent her from identifying him. The second was that the burglary was a ruse devised to mask the real motive. Perhaps the killer had harbored some personal grudge against Susan. This certainly fit the callous nature of the execution. The problem was in finding anyone who'd harbored animosity towards the young woman. Those who knew Susan described her as a caring and affable person, well-liked by everyone. Well, perhaps not everyone. As detectives began delving into Susan Schwartz's background, they identified one individual who might have meant her harm. His name was Gregory Johnson. He was 26 years old, and he was married to a former high school classmate of the murdered woman. Johnson was no stranger to law enforcement. He was an ex-con with a long record for robbery, drugs, and crimes of violence, including domestic abuse against his wife. It appeared that Susan had recently counseled her old school friend to take refuge at a shelter for battered women. She'd then assisted the woman in making a move to Minnesota with her 2-year-old son. Johnson had apparently been furious when he found out. Unfortunately, the much-abused Mrs. Johnson still appeared to harbor feelings for her violent husband. Within months, she was back in Washington and talking about a reconciliation. During this visit, she stayed at Susan's house, and Susan counseled her against patching things up with her ex. The woman had apparently taken this advice and returned to Minnesota. Just a few weeks later, Susan Schwartz would be dead. Gregory Johnson had been suspect number 1 during the initial inquiry. Questioned by detectives, he'd claimed that he'd been fishing in Everett with his brother at the time that Susan was killed. That alibi was never verified to the satisfaction of investigators. In fact, they remained so convinced that Johnson was their man that they decided to have another crack at him in 1986, when he was serving time for robbery. On this occasion, Johnson had a different story to tell. He now claimed that he had dropped his brother and another man at Susan Schwartz's house on the day she was killed. They were only meant to rob the place, but something went wrong. Later, according to Johnson, his brother admitted to him that he'd shot Susan. The police did not believe a word of it. Unfortunately, they had nothing to back up their suspicions. The Schwartz case would remain cold and apparently unsolvable until 2010. That was when an inmate looked down at his poker hand and saw a pretty young woman with red hair looking back at him. Flipping the card over, he started reading the case details printed on the back. Then he stopped mid-sentence and started reading again. He'd heard this story before. It had been told to him by one of his fellow cons. The card had a hotline number printed on the back. As soon as it was convenient to do so, the inmate called it. The tip-off was a break, and an important one, but it was by no means a case closer. Only 2 things would achieve that end: a confession or a corroborating witness. Gregory Johnson, investigators knew, was never going to come clean. Not on the word of a fellow con. That meant that the police would need to come up with a witness who could put Johnson inside the Schwartz residence on the day that Susan was killed. It was then they learned of a woman who had dated Johnson around the time of the Schwartz murder. Back then, she'd been a teenager. Now she was 50, a qualified nurse, a wife, and a mother, living in Everett. Perhaps she had seen or heard something back then, something that could help their case. It was time to find out. The witness, we'll call her Vivian since her real identity is protected, wasn't exactly surprised when Snohomish County detectives came knocking on her door in 2011. She'd been expecting them, even hoping that they'd show up. There was something that she'd been carrying on her conscience for 3 decades, something she needed to get off her chest. According to Vivian, she'd met Gregory Johnson in 1979, shortly after he'd split from his wife. She was just 17 then, and her father had recently died, making her vulnerable, easy prey for a smooth talker like Johnson. At first, he was pleasant enough, charming even. But things quickly changed once she moved in with him. Now he was suddenly violent and controlling, turning her against her family, isolating her from her friends. He even allowed his buddies to physically and sexually abuse her. So far, Vivian had provided nothing earth-shattering to the detectives, nothing they didn't already know about their suspect. That was about to change. Skipping ahead to the day of the murder, Vivian said that Johnson had told her to take a drive with him, saying that he was going to see a friend who owed him money and drugs. Since questioning anything he said might earn her a beating, she got into the car right away. Johnson then drove to the Alderwood Manor neighborhood, stopping in front of a house on Locust Way. Here, he ordered her to come inside with him. The front door was unlocked when Johnson tried it. Entering the house, Johnson indicated for her to remain in the lounge while he set off down the hall, moving furtively. A short while later, she heard sounds of a struggle and heard a woman cry out. Then it was quiet for a moment, and then the silence was broken by the distinctive sound of a gunshot. Every instinct in Vivian's body told her to flee at this point, to run from the house, and just keep going until she was out of the reach of her malignant boyfriend. But Johnson had her so petrified by this time that she didn't run. Instead, she walked down the hall, heading in the same direction he'd taken. In the bathroom, she came upon a terrible scene. There was a naked woman on the floor, unmoving, bleeding from a head wound. "This is what happens to people who fuck with my life," Johnson said, when he spotted Vivian standing in the doorway. He then lifted the woman's head by the hair, held the gun just a few inches away, and fired another bullet into her brain. Vivian did not know the identity of the victim until she read about it later in the paper. It was Susan Schwartz. So why didn't Vivian go to the police at that point? The answer was twofold. On the one hand, Johnson had told her that she was an accomplice to murder, and thus as guilty as he was under the law. On the other, he threatened her family. "You say anything and they all die," he warned. Vivian knew that he was serious. Even after she managed to escape his clutches, while he was serving the term for robbery, she remained terrified of him. The first thing he did after his release from prison was to track her down and reiterate his warning. "Keep your mouth shut if you want to live. I know where to find you and your family." But now, 37 years later, Vivian was ready to talk, to repeat her allegations in front of a jury. Susan's family deserved justice. Confronted with Vivian's eyewitness statement, Johnson must have known that his time was up. Rather than take his chances in open court, he asked for a deal, agreeing to plead to second-degree murder. That saved him from the prospect of life without parole, but still earned him a hefty jail term. He will serve a minimum of 24 years, remaining behind bars until his mid-70s at least. Given his criminal record, there is every chance that he will serve longer than that, every likelihood that he will die in prison. The Queen of Hearts had come up trumps. Killing Ground. The BBC television program, Crime Watch, is an institution in Britain. Similar in format to America's Most Wanted, the show features reconstructions of unsolved crimes and appeals to the public for help in bringing the perpetrator to justice. This has met with considerable success over the years. In the 25-plus years that it has been on air, tips phoned into the Crime Watch hotline have been instrumental in closing over 100 major cases, including 57 murders. However, the case that launched the program in June 1984 was not one of them. That would only be solved decades later by a traffic stop, a bloody tissue, and a chilling confession. Colette Aram was 16 years old, a pretty, dark-haired girl currently pursuing her dream of becoming a hairdresser. Colette lived with her parents and her brother Mark in Keyworth, a village in Nottinghamshire. She had a steady boyfriend, and she often met up with him after work, as she planned to do on the evening of October 30th, 1983. Usually, Russell Godfrey would pick up Colette at her parents' house, but his car was in for repairs, so on this evening, Colette decided to walk the 1.5 miles to his house. She left home at around 8 o'clock and was seen some 10 minutes later, talking to a group of her friends near Nicker Hill, about halfway through her journey. Then, inexplicably, Colette Aram disappeared. The alarm on the missing girl was raised almost immediately. When she did not arrive at her boyfriend's house, he called her home to find out if she'd changed her mind about coming over. That call caused concern in the Aram household. Colette had left over an hour earlier. She should have reached her destination long ago. A series of increasingly frantic phone calls raised the panic level even further. Colette hadn't stopped off at any of her friends. Soon, a search would be underway with family, friends, and neighbors combing the neighborhood and Colette's brother walking the route she would have taken, questioning anyone he encountered along the way. Nothing. Eventually, at 10:30 p.m., the police were called in. The search for Colette Aram would continue through the night without success. It would be resolved at 9 o'clock the next morning, when the teenager's ravished corpse was found in a field off Thirlby Lane, about a mile from where she'd last been seen alive. It was Colette's brother, Mark, who had the dreadful misfortune of finding her, her body left in a provocative pose by the monster who'd taken her life. An autopsy would reveal that Colette had been subjected to a savage rape and had suffered blunt force trauma to the head. Death, though, was by strangulation. After having his brutal way with her, the killer had put his hands on Colette's throat and snuffed out her life. The murder of Colette Aram sent ripples of fear through the tiny, peaceable village of Keyworth and its surrounds. Who could have done such a thing? Surely not someone living locally. Surely this must have been some predator from the big city, trawling for prey outside his normal domain? That theory was given credence when a witness came forward to say that she had heard a woman screaming, followed by the sound of a car racing off at high speed. Since this was reported at 8:10, close to the abduction site, the police were taking it seriously. Another clue, provided by the landlady of the Generous Britain pub in Costock, seemed less promising. She reported that a customer had entered the establishment that evening with blood on his hands. The man had ordered a beer and a sandwich. He'd left behind a blood-stained paper towel, which the landlady now handed over to the police. The item was bagged and tagged. In those pre-DNA days, it would be of more use in eliminating a suspect than arresting one. 7 months after her death, on June 7, 1984, the murder of Colette Aram would be the first to feature on Crime Watch. The broadcast generated a significant response, with over 400 tips called in. None of them got the police any closer to catching the killer. The case was featured again in 2004, on the 20th anniversary of the show. This, too, produced a deluge of tips, but no arrests. But the police had by now generated a significant clue, courtesy of the bloodied paper towel. In the intervening decades, DNA profiling had become a mainstay of criminal investigations. The paper towel had been submitted for testing and had returned 2 profiles, one of which belonged to Colette Aram. This proved to investigators that the pub customer had contact with Colette on the night she died and was probably her killer. Unfortunately, there was no match to his profile. Whoever he was, he had managed to stay off police radars for 2.5 decades. That was about to change. In June 2008, Nottinghamshire police pulled over a young man named Jean-Paul Hutchinson for a traffic offense. Hutchinson was arrested at the scene and therefore required to provide a DNA swab. When this was entered into the national database, it provided a match to the killer of Colette Aram. Jean-Paul, of course, could not be Colette's killer. At 20 years of age, he hadn't even been born at the time that she met her terrible demise. The match, in any case, wasn't exact. It was a familial match. The killer of Colette Aram was someone in Jean-Paul Hutchinson's immediate family. In fact, it could only be one person, his father, Paul. Paul Stewart Hutchinson was 50 years old on the day that police arrived to take him into custody in April 2009. That would have made him 25 on the night he snuffed out Colette Aram's young life. In the intervening years, He'd married twice and fathered 4 children. He'd started a successful business and managed to stay out of trouble. That had kept him out of the reach of law enforcement. Until now. Initially, Hutchinson tried to blame his brother, Gerhard, who had died in January of 2008 and had been cremated. However, Gerhard was easily eliminated. A local hospital had a sample of his blood in storage, and it did not match the DNA of the killer. Paul Hutchinson's DNA, however, was a perfect match. The chances that someone else had killed Colette were too astronomical to calculate. Eventually, the hopelessness of his situation must have dawned on Hutchinson. At a pretrial hearing on December 21, 2009, he admitted what everyone already knew, that it was he who'd ended the teenager's life. Hutchinson's confession to the murder of Colette Aram makes for chilling reading. He said that he'd been out trawling for a victim that day and had spent much of the afternoon hiding in a shed at a local riding school, spying on young girls. However, he'd been unable to find a lone girl to attack, and so he'd left. The dusk hours had found him strolling the streets, still hunting. Then he'd come across an unlocked Ford Fiesta and stolen it. The vehicle allowed him to cast a wider net. At one point, he'd approached 2 young girls and tried to force them into the car at knife point. However, the girls had started screaming and run away. Their lucky escape would spell doom for Colette Aram. Dragged into the Ford with a knife at her throat, the 16-year-old was driven to Thirlby Lane, to the field that would be her place of dying. Here, she was struck twice on the head with a bottle. That dazed Colette, but she was still fully conscious when her attacker ripped off her clothes and subjected her to a brutal rape. Then, having sated himself, Hutchinson put his hands on her throat and choked the life out of her. Colette was left where she'd been killed. Even then, Hutchinson could not resist subjecting her to one final indignity. The murdered girl was left with her legs splayed, to be found the next day by her brother. Paul Hutchinson was sentenced to life in prison, with a minimum of 25 years to be served before he would be eligible for parole. But Hutchinson would spend less than a year behind bars. On October 10, 2010, he was found unresponsive in his cell at HM Prison, Nottingham. Paramedics were called to resuscitate him, but immediately recommended transfer to a hospital. Hutchinson died in the ambulance. The heartless killer had taken his own life by swallowing an overdose of his prescription medication. Most would say that he'd done the world a favor by removing himself from it. Cop killer. To his friends and neighbors in Columbia, South Carolina, Gerald Mason was a model citizen, a successful businessman who had sold his 7 gas stations in the mid-90s and retired to a life of leisure. The 69-year-old was still active, enjoying golf and bowling and visits from his daughters and grandchildren. He was sociable, easygoing, and well-liked. So, when a small convoy of police vehicles screeched to a halt in front of Mason's luxury home in January 2003, everyone on the street assumed that the officers had made a mistake or been misdirected. Imagine their surprise when they saw their affable neighbor being led away in handcuffs. Gerald Mason had just been arrested for murder, for crimes he'd committed in another lifetime. Gerald Mason was born in Columbia, South Carolina, in January 1934. We don't know much about his childhood, but we do know that he took the criminal path early in life, serving a prison term for burglary in his early 20s. He was released from that term in 1957, at age 23, and then decided to hitchhike cross-country to California. Stopping along the route in Shreveport, Louisiana, Mason purchased a revolver, using the alias George D. Wilson. He'd later claim that this was for protection while hitchhiking. If that was the case, it did its job. By July 22nd, Mason was in El Segundo, California, prowling a suburban neighborhood when he came across 4 teenagers sitting in a parked vehicle. The kids, 2 boys and 2 girls, were aged between 15 and 17. Earlier that evening, they'd attended a party. Then, on their way home, they'd made the fateful decision to stop off at the local Lover's Lane. They'd barely parked when the driver, 17-year-old Bob Dewar, heard a knock on his window and saw a man standing there. Bob rolled down the pane and instantly had a gun shoved in his face. "This is a robbery," Gerald Mason growled. "Nobody move." Thus began a night of pure terror for the 4 teenagers. They were forced from the vehicle at gunpoint, then forced to strip before having their hands secured with duct tape. A strip of tape was also plastered across their mouths, making it impossible for them to cry out. The gunman then dragged one of the 15-year-old girls into the car and raped her. He then calmly informed the teens that he was going to kill them and ordered them to walk ahead of them into a field. Bob Dewar and his friends had no option but to obey. They were led into the dark, with the girls sobbing silently behind their gags. They must have thought that they were living their last moments on Earth. But thankfully, the gunman had a change of heart. Rather than shooting the teens, he left them naked and bound in the middle of the field. He then drove away in their car, taking their belongings with him. But George Mason's night of crime was only just getting started. A short while later, he pulled the stolen Ford to a stop at a red light on Sepulveda Boulevard. At this time of night, the usually busy thoroughfare was all but deserted. Glancing left and right, Mason decided to run the light. What Mason didn't see was that there was a black and white cruiser parked at the curb, less than half a block away on Rosecrans Avenue. Aboard were 2 young El Segundo police officers. Officer Richard Phillips was quite new to the job. His partner, Officer Milton Curtis, was greener still. Spotting the traffic violation, Curtis started up the patrol car and went after the Ford. He and his partner thought that this was a routine traffic stop. They had no idea that the Ford was stolen or that its driver had just committed a rape and robbery. For Gerald Mason, though, this was the real deal. He was being pulled over for multiple felonies and was looking at years, probably decades, behind bars. Right there and then, with the police cruiser flashing its lights behind him and directing him towards the curb, he decided that he wasn't going to be taken. As one of the cops approached, carrying a citation book, Mason got out of the vehicle and opened fire, emptying the revolver. Officer Curtis, still sitting in the patrol car, was hit 3 times. Officer Phillips took 3 bullets and collapsed to the sidewalk. As the gunman scrambled into his car and raced away, Phillips somehow managed to pull off 6 shots. Then, the gravely injured man crawled back to the cruiser and summoned help. Another unit, patrolling the same area, was there within a minute. But it was already too late. Curtis was dead. Phillips was mortally wounded and would die on the way to the hospital. Officer Phillips's 999 call had come over the radio at 1:28 a.m. Officers Gilbert and Porter had responded immediately, arriving at 1:29. By then, other units were already racing towards the area, as is common with an officer down alert. Hundreds of cops, from El Segundo and neighboring jurisdictions, would scour the area all through the night. During that search, they found the stolen Ford abandoned on a side street. Of the suspect, though, there was no sign. Somehow, against all odds, Gerald Mason had escaped the dragnet. The murder of the El Segundo police officers would spark one of the biggest homicide investigations in California history. At the center of it all was the stolen Ford, which was examined from bumper to bumper in the search for evidence. These days, CSIs would be looking primarily for DNA. Back then, the best they could hope for was fingerprints. And they were successful in that quest, if only moderately. 2 partial thumbprints were lifted from the steering wheel. These might be useful in nailing the suspect. First, though, the police would have to find him. Another piece of information to be gleaned from the stolen car was the bullet holes. 6 rounds had been fired at the fleeing vehicle, fired by Officer Phillips even as he lay dying on the sidewalk. 3 of those bullets had penetrated into the interior, but only 2 slugs had been recovered, suggesting that the perpetrator had been hit. How seriously was he hurt? Seriously enough to need medical attention? Unfortunately, a trawl through local hospital admissions turned up nothing. But what the police did have was a description of their suspect, courtesy of the teenagers he'd brutalized. The teens were found naked and terrified, wandering the streets as they looked for help. Now, finally, the police understood the perpetrator's overreaction. He hadn't been running from a traffic citation. He'd been running from a felony arrest. In any case, the police could now narrow their search. The man they were looking for was 6 feet tall, around 200 pounds, with short, dark hair. He had a peculiar way of holding his head, slightly at an angle. It wasn't a lot to go on, but it was something. The police were quietly confident that they'd catch the cop killer. For the next 4 decades plus, they would be proved wrong. Then, in September 2002, came a totally unexpected break in the case. That was when a woman called the El Segundo Police Department and said that she had information on the murders of the 2 police officers. According to the tipster, her uncle had bragged about killing 2 cops back in the 50s. The woman provided a name, and the uncle turned out to have a record, which meant that his prints were on file. These were compared to the partials from the 1957 case file. Unfortunately, they did not match. However, the failed test had reignited interest in the decades-old case, and so the prints were submitted for comparison against the FBI's national database. This had been created after the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, and had expanded to the point where it contained the fingerprints of every convicted criminal in every state in the nation. The computer took only a few minutes to return a match. The prints belonged to Gerald F. Mason, a man who'd done time for burglary in 1956, but who'd not had a single conviction or arrest since. Finding Gerald Mason was easy. He was quickly traced to an upscale neighborhood in Colombia, where he was living the life, having recently retired. His response when police officers showed up on his doorstep was total disbelief. Told that he was wanted in connection with the murders of 2 El Segundo police officers, all Mason could offer was an incredulous, "You're here for that?" The case against Mason was strong. Aside from the fingerprints, there was the murder weapon, which had been found at a Manhattan Beach property in 1960 by a man doing yard work. The police had tracked the purchase of the weapon back to Louisiana. Mason had used an alias to buy the gun, but the handwriting on the application form was undoubtedly his. This was confirmed by a forensic graphologist. Aside from that, there was a scar to Mason's side, where he'd been struck by the bullet fired by Officer Phillips. Just how Mason was able to elude the massive manhunt that was launched for him remains somewhat of a puzzle. It may be because he was smart enough to get out of California immediately, limping back to South Carolina like a wounded animal. And it was perhaps the fear of being connected to the cop killings that kept him on the straight and narrow in the years to come. A conviction would almost certainly have landed him with the death penalty, so he had plenty of motivation. In any case, he married, raised kids and grandkids, built a business empire, retired a wealthy man. But for a random phone call by a woman he'd never met, he might well have gotten away with murder. Gerald Mason was brought to trial in 2003 and entered guilty pleas to the 2 murders. He was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms, with parole eligibility in 7 years. This was part of a deal struck with prosecutors whereby rape, robbery, and grand theft charges were dropped. Mason would also be allowed to serve his time in South Carolina so that he could be close to his family. The double cop killer was teary-eyed at his sentencing, telling the court that he was deeply remorseful. "I do not understand why I did this. It does not fit in my life. It is not the person I know. I detest these crimes." These were hollow words, especially for the families of the slain officers. As one El Segundo detective put it, "The only thing he's truly sorry about is that he was caught." And if Mason thought that his keening apology would help him come parole time, he would be sorely disappointed. California prosecutors were determined that he would never be released. In 2009, the now 75-year-old Mason was turned down for early release. His next hearing was scheduled for March 2024, but he never made it that far. Gerald Mason died in prison on January 22, 2017, 9 days before his 83rd birthday. The cop killer had lived nearly twice as long as the combined ages of his victims. Bloody Sunday. On a Sunday afternoon in October 1955, 14-year-old Robert Peterson and two friends, Anton Schuessler, 13, and John Schuessler, 11, left their home in a Chicago suburb and headed downtown to catch a movie. The film they were going to watch was a Disney documentary, The African Lion. They never returned from the showing. The brothers Schuessler and Robert Peterson were all polite, obedient kids, raised in stable, middle-class homes where curfews were respected. It was entirely out of character for them to disobey their parents. If they had done so, then likely there was a problem. Eventually, after several hours of fretting, the boys' fathers took a car and headed downtown to look for them. That search would come up empty. The boys weren't at the movie theater where The African Lion was showing, or at any other in the area. Then Mr. Peterson suggested that they check out bowling alleys, since his son Robert liked to bowl. Here, the men got their first lead. Bobby Peterson and the Schuessler boys had visited at least one bowling alley that afternoon. Now, though, they were nowhere to be found. It was at that point that the desperate fathers decided to call in the police. By morning, a search was underway. Frustratingly, worryingly, it found no trace of the youths. The next 2 days were a time of desperation for the Schuessler and Peterson families. They were frantic for word of their sons, desperate that they would be found alive and unharmed. Yet rationality chiseled away at that vain hope, robbing them of sleep and sanity. And then, on the afternoon of Tuesday, October 18th, came the news they'd been dreading. Earlier that day, a man had been hiking a gravel path in a wooded area of Northwest. What had started out as a pleasant stroll was soon transformed into a horrific experience the hiker would never forget. A naked body lay in a ditch, its pale skin an unearthly, bluish hue. The man left the area at a sprint and ran for the nearest payphone to call the police. As it turned out, there were 3 bodies, not one, piled on top of each other like logs of wood. The lost boys had been found. This was a quite horrific crime, described by the media of the day as one of the most brutal in Chicago's history. The boys had all been strangled, and Robert Peterson had also suffered 14 stab wounds, probably as he tried to fight off the attacker. The motive for the murders was obvious. At least one of the young victims had been sexually assaulted. As for evidence, the police declared themselves to be baffled by the lack thereof. A modern CSI team would undoubtedly have gleaned plenty of forensics from the scene. Back in the 1950s, though, evidence gathering was less of an art, more of a case of blundering through the crime scene in the hope of finding something useful. The area was not even cordoned off, allowing dozens of officers and members of the media to traipse through, trampling potentially valuable clues into the dirt. Little wonder that this investigation never really got off the ground. Within weeks, it had sputtered to a halt and stalled, possibly without hope of revival. For Albert Schuessler Jr., The anguish of losing his two young sons in such a brutal way was just too much to bear. 1 month after the murders, he suffered a fatal heart attack. He was only 41 years old. As for the murder inquiry, that was never likely to be resolved, not with the paucity of evidence and the complete lack of witnesses. For 4 decades, it remained among the coldest of cold cases on the Chicago PD books. Then, in 1994, came a surprise break. The police had been investigating another high-profile case, the 1977 disappearance of candy heiress Helen Voorhees Brock. This was believed to be linked to a much broader case of insurance fraud. During the 1970s, there had been several fires in the area, all of them involving horse stables. Dozens of high-value horses had also been killed, with the owners pocketing large payoffs. Helen Voorhees Brock had been a keen horsewoman. The speculation was that she knew about the scheme and its perpetrators had been disappeared to prevent her talking to the authorities. One name kept coming up during this inquiry, the name of millionaire horse breeder Silas Jane. A controversial figure, Jane had reputed mob connections and had been implicated in several homicides and disappearances, as well as multiple cases of arson. He was eventually convicted in the 1970 shooting death of his brother, George, serving 7 years in prison as a result. He died of leukemia in 1987 at the age of 80. But it wasn't Jane that interested cold case investigators in 1994. It was one of his former employers. Kenneth Hansen had been 22 years old at the time of the Peterson-Schuessler killings and had been working as a stable hand at Silas Jane's Idle Hours stables. Hansen was known to cruise the area looking for young male hitchhikers who he'd lure back to the farm by promising to show them his boss's prize horses. Once there, he'd solicit the boys for sex, first promising money and then becoming violent if he was turned down. Hansen was hardly discreet about these encounters. He spoke openly about raping his young victims, and even boasted about the Peterson-Schuessler murders. A favorite threat of his was to warn anyone who opposed him that they'd end up like the Peterson boy. Given his lack of discretion, it was amazing that the police were only hearing about it now. But here it was, the opportunity to close the book on one of Chicago's most infamous murder cases. In July of 1994, Kenneth Hansen was arrested for starting a 1970 fire that destroyed the premises of one of his boss's competitors. Later that same day, he was charged with the murders of Robert Peterson, Anton Schuessler, and John Schuessler. Reconstructing the timeline in preparation for trial, Cook County prosecutors theorized that the boys had watched their movie on that tragic October day, then visited a bowling alley before deciding to head home. They'd stood at the roadside with their thumbs out, and it was to their massive misfortune that Kenneth Hansen was the person who stopped for them. Hansen then offered his usual tour of the stables, which the boys accepted. Once there, he suggested his familiar inducements for sex, and was refused. This was where things got ugly. Hansen started assaulting John and Anton. Robert stepped in to protect his friends. His bravery would see him savagely stabbed. Now there was no way back for Hansen. One by one, he strangled the boys to death, ending with the gravely injured Robert Peterson. Then he loaded the bodies into his car and dumped them in the woods where they'd be found 2 days later. Several witnesses would swear under oath that this was what Hansen had told them. There is one additional piece of evidence that adds credence to the story. According to insiders, Silas Jane got to hear that Hansen was the man responsible for the murders that were being so widely reported in the media. Jane was reportedly furious that Hansen's actions might bring police attention down on him. However, he needed Hansen, his arsonist-in-chief, and so he let it fly. Months after the murders, when the police announced that they would be exhuming the boys' bodies to look for additional evidence, a fire broke out at Idle Hours stables, burning the place to the ground. Investigators now believed that the fire was set to destroy potential evidence. The autopsies would provide one vital clue, though. Each of the victims had tiny particles of hay in his lungs. Kenneth Hansen went on trial in 1995. Charged with 3 counts of murder, he was found guilty and sentenced to 300 years in prison. 5 years later, the conviction was overturned when the Illinois Appellate Court ruled that the jury should not have heard evidence about Hansen's habit of cruising the streets for teenaged hitchhikers. Hansen won a new trial, but the outcome was the same: guilty of murder, 300 years behind bars. Hansen would serve only a small portion of that time. He died at the Pontiac Correctional Center in 2007 at the age of 74. Right until the end, he had continued to protest his innocence. This was quite a turnaround from the years he'd spent glorifying the rape and murder of 3 innocent kids. Blood Moon. It was the summer of 1974. Across the nation, 2 stories dominated the news. The first was the Watergate scandal, which would soon lead to the resignation of President Richard Milhous Nixon. The second was the kidnapping of heiress Patty Hearst by the domestic terrorist group known as the Symbionese Liberation Army. Neither of those stories was of particular interest to 21-year-old Cheryl Miller on the night of Friday, June 14th. The beautiful art student had just extricated herself from a troublesome relationship and was going out to celebrate with her friend and roommate, Maxine Gutierrez. The pair ended up that night at the Scene Bar, easily the most popular night spot in the gritty factory town of Saginaw, Michigan. But the occasion would be an uncomfortable one for Cheryl. Her former boyfriend, Iranian exchange student Abbas Esfahani, was there, and he kept glaring at her from across the room. Eventually, Esfahani left, and Cheryl could relax a little. She would remain at the bar until the early morning hours. Then, since Maxine wanted to continue partying, she left alone, riding home on her motorcycle. It was 6 a.m. the following morning before Maxine Gutierrez eventually made it home. The apartment was silent when Maxine entered, but that was to be expected. Cheryl was probably fast asleep. Then, Maxine passed by Cheryl's bedroom and peered inside, and her whole world was turned instantly upside down. Cheryl was lying on the floor, unmoving. All around her were signs that a violent struggle had taken place: an overturned chair, a shattered lamp, books strewn across the room. Rushing in, Maxine fell to her knees beside her friend, grabbed her by the shoulder, and started shaking her. But it should have been clear from Cheryl's sightless eyes, from her bruised lips and the ugly purple marks on her throat, that Cheryl wasn't waking up. Staggering to her feet, Maxine went to call the police. Detectives Ron Herzberg and Tom Reeder were assigned to the case, and they soon determined how the killer had entered the apartment. The screen had been removed from a downstairs window, and the curtains were hanging outside the frame, getting soaked in the steady rain that was now falling. Whether he'd entered before Cheryl or after her was uncertain. The motive was easy to establish, though. Cheryl Miller had been raped. An autopsy would retrieve semen from the body, and also 2 dark hairs. The medical examiner put the time of death at between 5:30 and 6 a.m. One important clue that emerged early in the investigation was the fact that the killer-rapist was sterile. The semen retrieved from the body was devoid of sperm, and the police soon had a strong suspect. Talking to the dead woman's friends and family, they learned about her troubled relationship with Abbas Esfahani. Cheryl had told her family that she was afraid of Esfahani because of his fierce temper. He was also extremely possessive of her, and had not taken it well when she'd ended the relationship. Since then, he'd been harassing her for another chance, which Cheryl had refused. So Esfahani had motive, and there were also forensic clues linking him to the crime scene. His fingerprints were found on the banister leading upstairs to Cheryl's bedroom, and the dark hairs found on the corpse matched his hair color. Unfortunately, the police never got the chance to interview Esfahani. When they went to pick him up, they found that he'd boarded a plane back to Iran. Cheryl had been killed early on Saturday morning. Over the next 2 days, Esfahani had sold his car and all of his belongings. He'd booked a flight on Monday, just 48 hours after the murder. This, of course, was highly suspicious. The police in Michigan therefore got in touch with their counterparts in Iran and arranged for Esfahani to be picked up. There was never a chance that he'd be sent back to the U.S., but the Iranians did, at least, send over a sample of his hair. This was compared to the hairs lifted from the crime scene. It did not match. The next suspect to appear on police radars was Antonio Alvarez, a cousin of Maxine Gutierrez, who'd crashed at the apartment for a couple of weeks while looking for a place to stay. Alvarez's prints had been found all over the residence, but that was only to be expected since he'd lived there. His hair was similar to the hairs found on Cheryl's body. The problem was that Alvarez wasn't sterile, which means that he could not have been the man who'd raped Cheryl. He was eliminated as a suspect. It was at this point in the investigation that attention turned to a third suspect, 27-year-old Gabriel Ferris. Born into a prominent Saginaw family, Ferris was a man with a troubled past. He had several drug convictions on his police record. The thing that initially drew attention to Ferris was his fingerprints, which had been found on a dresser in Cheryl's room. That, as it turned out, was easily explained away. Ferris had been in a sexual relationship with Cheryl Miller, which had only recently ended when he got married. Aside from that, Ferris was blonde, not dark-haired, and he was not sterile. As if that weren't enough to discount him as a suspect, Ferris had the perfect alibi. At the time of the murder, he'd been at a hotel on Lake Huron, 65 miles away, enjoying his honeymoon. His new bride, Terry Egaz, confirmed this. The Saginaw police had started their investigation with 3 strong suspects. 2 of those had now been eliminated, and the third was out of their reach, in a country that was never going to extradite him to the United States. There was more reason than ever to believe that Abbas Esfahani was the man responsible. The police had found a hairbrush in Esfahani's recently vacated apartment and compared hairs from the brush to the sample sent from Iran. It did not match, suggesting that the Iranian authorities had sent over a sample from some random individual rather than one from Esfahani. Comparing the brush hairs to those found at the crime scene returned an inconclusive result. From that point on, the investigation was in trouble. To the frustration of the investigators involved, it would end up eventually in the cold case files. And there it would remain for the next 20 years, until, out of the blue, there was a break in the case. Terry Egaz, by now the former Mrs. Ferris, got in touch with investigators and informed them that she had not told the whole truth about her honeymoon night. Terry had originally told the police that she and Gabriel had gone to bed at 10 p.m. and stayed there until 5 a.m. Now, she had a different story to tell. She said that she'd woken alone that morning, just as the sun was coming up. Gabriel had returned a few minutes later, saying that he'd gone for a drive. He had spots of blood on his clothes. When she asked him about this, he said that he'd hit a rabbit while driving. The poor animal had become lodged in the wheel well of the car, and he'd had to pull it out. Later that day, the story of Cheryl's murder had come on the news, and Gabriel had started crying, or rather, pretend crying, as Terry described it. He'd told her that Cheryl was the girl who he'd dated before he met her. The statement given by Terry Egaz seriously weakened her former husband's alibi. It would certainly have been possible for Ferris to get up in the middle of the night, drive the 65 miles to Saginaw, commit the murder, and then return to his marital bed. But the forensics still seemed to exonerate Ferris. He did not have dark hair. He wasn't sterile. and there was a perfectly sound explanation for his fingerprints being at the crime scene. But what if prosecutors could explain away these apparent anomalies? As it turned out, they could. Let's begin with the hairs. The police now admitted that improved forensic methods had allowed them to match these to one of the other suspects, Antonio Alvarez. However, they contended that these had not been deposited on Cheryl's body by her killer. They believed that the hairs had been on the carpet and had adhered to the victim's skin while she was on the ground, struggling with her attacker. Then there was the seminal fluid, which the police now contended wasn't semen at all, but fluid from the victim's body. Finally, there were the fingerprints, the one piece of evidence that made the case. It wasn't the prints themselves, but rather their location, on the lower drawers of the dresser, just inches from Cheryl's head. According to the experts, they'd been left there by Gabriel Ferris while he was strangling the life out of his victim. On the face of it, this was a far from solid case. Ferris's lawyers were confident of victory, and that belief was vindicated when the first trial ended in a hung jury and the second in a conviction that was swiftly overturned. But the state of Michigan seemed determined to hold Gabriel Ferris to account, and so the matter was brought to trial for a third time. As in the first two trials, the defense pointed out some gaping holes in the prosecution case. The first was timing. Terry Egaz had claimed that her husband had returned to their bungalow just as the sun was coming up. That would have put the time at around 6 a.m. The medical examiner had estimated the time of death between 5:30 and 6. How did that leave time for Ferris to drive the 65 miles from Saginaw to the shores of Lake Huron? The second defense argument had to do with the lack of any of Ferris's hair at the scene. Cheryl Miller had fought hard for her life. Was it really possible that not a single strand of her attacker's hair was dislodged during that struggle? How likely was that? The defense then laid out its arguments for alternate suspects, namely Abbas Esfahani and Antonio Alvarez. Alvarez's hair had been found on the victim, while Esfahani had a strong motive and had fled the country. What motive did Ferris have? Was it likely that he'd leave his honeymoon bed and make a 130-mile round trip to rape and murder his ex-girlfriend? To this argument, at least, the prosecution was able to offer a riposte. It alleged that Ferris had actually arranged to meet up with Cheryl the previous evening, the night of his stag party. But he'd been unable to get away without arousing suspicion, and so he'd gone to visit her on his honeymoon instead. He'd hoped to have sex with her one last time, but Cheryl had rebuffed him, saying that she wouldn't sleep with a married man. That was when he'd decided to take by force what was denied to him. In the process of raping Cheryl, he'd choked the life out of her, perhaps by accident, perhaps by design. Either way, it was felony murder. The case was now in the hands of the jury, with Ferris and his team confident of an acquittal. Ferris was even talking about buying a sailboat once he walked free and taking a cruise down the eastern seaboard. He was in for a shock when the verdict was returned. Guilty as charged. In June 2004, almost 30 years to the day from Cheryl Miller's murder, Gabriel Ferris was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole. Justice had been much delayed in Cheryl's case, and neither her mother nor her father had lived long enough to see it done. For the rest of the family, there was a sense of elation. This was a brutal and senseless killing, snuffing out the life of a beautiful, talented, and free-spirited young woman. But this is also one of those cases that leaves questions unanswered. Gabriel Ferris continues to protest his innocence from behind bars. There are many who believe him, many who will tell you that the Michigan authorities convicted the wrong man. Night Shift. Jeanette, Annette, and Suzette Pritchard were about as close as sisters could be. They were, after all, triplets, with all of the quirks that multiple birth siblings typically have. Growing up, the girls dressed alike, had similar mannerisms, and completed each other's sentences. Still, they all had their own personalities. Suzette, for example, was known as the prissy one and playfully teased by her sisters about it. A caring individual who had a particular affinity with children, she had plans of becoming a religious studies teacher. In 1986, she was enrolled at a Baptist college in her hometown of Great Falls, Montana. 1986 was also the year that Suzette started a part-time job as a cashier at Keith's Town Pump on 10th Avenue South. The night of October 6th was to be the first time she'd fly solo after her period of training, and the 18-year-old was quite anxious about it. She'd have been even more nervous without the support of her friends and family. Throughout that evening, Suzette's friends, Becky Hill and Vicky Kuhn, and her sister, Annette, dropped by periodically to visit. When they called on her at 12:55 a.m., Suzette said that she was craving French fries, and so her friends and sister drove to a nearby Burger King to get her some. When they returned, some 5 minutes later, they spotted a battered, maroon-colored car with rear-end damage. It was parked behind the convenience store, which was unusual since there was plenty of parking out front. However, the girls thought nothing of it at the time. While Annette and Becky waited in the vehicle, Vicky took the fries in to Suzette. As she entered the store, she spotted a man standing at the microwave. The man had his back to her, but then he turned and walked in her direction. He was probably in his mid-20s, shabbily dressed and with long, greasy hair. He also appeared to be intoxicated. The man stopped about 3 feet from Vicky and stood staring at her, swaying somewhat unsteadily on his feet. She gave him a nervous smile and said, "Hi." He made no response and continued staring. Vicky then walked to the counter and gave Suzette the French fries. She told her friend that she'd see her later and then left. Back at the car, she told the others about the man and said that he'd creeped her out. It was 1:08 a.m. when the 3 friends drove away from the town pump. Vicky then dropped Annette and Becky at their respective houses and went to meet up with her boyfriend. However, she could not get the creepy man out of her mind. Now that she thought about it, the way he'd been hanging around the store had seemed suspicious, almost as though he were waiting for her to leave. What if he'd been planning to rob the place? Worried for Suzette, Vicky told her boyfriend that she was driving back to the town pump to check on her friend. Her boyfriend insisted on going with her. They'd only just entered the store when they spotted Suzette lying on the floor by the counter. Her uniform was drenched in blood, and there was a pool of the stuff spreading out around her. Suzette Pritchard's first solo shift at the town pump had turned out to be her last. The first officer to arrive on the scene was there within minutes. However, there was nothing to be done for Suzette. The 18-year-old had been savagely stabbed to death. The coroner would later count 24 deep knife wounds to her chest, with the trajectory of the wounds suggesting that they had been inflicted from behind. From that, the police surmised that the killer had gained an arm hold on Suzette's throat before repeatedly plunging the knife in. The motive for so brutally ending the teenager's life was just shy of $300, taken from the till. Right from the start, there was one main suspect, the inebriated town pump customer, the man with the lank, dirty hair, the driver of the battered maroon car. As news of the murder broke, a man named Larry Blanchard came forward to say that he'd seen just such a vehicle racing away from the town pump when he'd driven past at around 1:20 a.m. He thought that it might be an old model Pontiac. This was not a cleverly thought-out crime, and it was one that the police were confident of solving. They had a solid description of the suspect, and they had a description of his vehicle. They also had another important clue. The last transaction that Suzette had rung up was for 99 cents, the exact price of a wrapped sandwich that was left on the counter. Quite obviously, the killer had placed it there, and if he'd handled it, then he'd probably left his prints behind. This assumption turned out to be correct. But the prints that crime scene technicians were able to lift were too smudged to be of any use. Elsewhere, the investigation was also running into trouble. Vicky, Becky, and Annette had all seen the suspect, the latter two through the storefront window, but none of them was able to pick him out of the multiple photo arrays they were shown. The police also issued a public appeal for information, but to little avail. The case was slipping away from them. In desperation, they turned their attention on a town pump employee named Joseph Grossbush, but eventually had to concede that he could not have committed the murder. 8 years passed. Then, in 1997, Great Falls police detective John Cameron got a tip from an informant telling him to check out a man named Donald Dubray as the killer of Suzette Pritchard. Following up on this lead, Cameron learned that Dubray was currently incarcerated at a federal prison, serving a 27-year term for rape. He'd also done time for robbery. In fact, Dubray's rap sheet ran to several pages and listed 9 felonies and over 100 misdemeanor convictions. Dubray had been living in the Great Falls area back in 1986, and that put him in the frame. Even more interesting was the information that the tipster shared regarding Dubray's car. At the time of the Pritchard murder, he'd been driving a maroon 1969 Pontiac with collision damage to the rear. This was how Donnie Dubray first came to the attention of the Great Falls police. Later, there would be testimony from his former girlfriend, Rose Valenzuela, who swore under oath that he had confessed the town pump murder and robbery to her. There were also the witnesses, who had seen Dubray at the town pump on the night Suzette was killed. Shown a photo array that now included Dubray's picture, Vicky Kuhn immediately picked him out. So too did Becky Hill and Annette Pritchard. Donald Dubray was arrested in his cell in January 1998 and charged with murder, theft, and aggravated robbery. At the subsequent trial, County Attorney Brant Light gave a scathing description of Dubray's character. Donald Dubray's entire life has been one of arrest, conviction, and disrespect for others, he told the jury. He must be warehoused for the protection of all of us. The jurors seemed to agree. They found Dubray guilty and recommended a sentence of life with no parole. The judge was happy to oblige. In August 2014, after serving his federal term, Dubray was transferred to the Montana State Prison to begin his life sentence. That would end up being just 2 years. In May 2016, Dubray was found dead in his cell. Cause of death was not revealed, but the prison authorities did not suspect foul play. The cold-hearted killer was 55 years old on the day he died. He had been responsible for much damage, much heartache during his half-century on this earth. His death is no loss to society, said Detective John Cameron, the man who'd brought the killer to justice. Cameron had since retired from law enforcement, but he still retained an interest in Dubray. He does not believe that we know the full extent of Dubray's murderous activities. In particular, Cameron suspects him of involvement in the slaying of Morris Davis, a pizza delivery man who was killed in April 1985. 18 months later, Suzette Pritchard would have the terrible misfortune of encountering Donnie Dubray during her final, fatal night shift. Darkness falls. Every kid loves Halloween, and Shauna Howe was no different. The 11-year-old was also a keen Girl Scout, and on October 27, 1992, she got to combine two of her favorite things. Her troop was hosting a Halloween party. Shauna's parents let her go, of course. They weren't going to make her miss the highlight of her year. Besides, Oil City, Pennsylvania was a safe place to live, and there'd be dozens of kids out trick-or-treating. Their only stipulation was that Shauna should be home by 8, right after the party ended. Shauna promised that she would be, and she was an obedient child. Her parents knew that she would not let them down. But Shauna wasn't home by 8 that night. When she still hadn't shown by 8:15, her mom, Lucy, called the scoutmaster, only to learn that Shauna had left the party 20 minutes earlier. That immediately set alarm bells jangling. Shauna's family then took to the streets to look for her. A short while later, they encountered a local resident, Dan Payton. Payton had some alarming information to share. He said that he'd seen a girl matching Shauna's description being dragged into a car at the corner of West First and Reed Streets, just 2 blocks from the Howe residence. Lucy barely listened to the end of his story before she was sprinting home to call the police. The response by the authorities was swift. Within an hour, a search was underway, with officers joined by friends and neighbors of the Howe family. They found no trace of Shauna that night. By the next day, the FBI had been called in, and a suspect had been identified, a local man named Eldred Ted Walker, whose car matched the description of the vehicle Shauna had been pulled into. Walker was well known to the local police as a habitual, low-level criminal. He denied knowing anything about Shauna's disappearance and consented to a search of his property and vehicle. However, the police found nothing incriminating and were forced to let him go. Meanwhile, the search for Shauna Howe continued, with the hope that she would be found alive receding with each passing hour. 2 days in, and a searcher found a strip of her gymnastic leotard near an abandoned railroad bed in a wooded area in nearby Rockland Township. And then, on October 30th, came confirmation of the terrible tragedy. Shauna's broken, battered corpse was found lying in a dry, rocky creek bed near Coulter's Hole in Rockland. The little girl, who had loved Girl Scouts and Sunday school, who'd had a special affinity with the old folks her troop used to visit at the convalescent home, who brought joy into so many lives, had died of blunt force trauma. Her killer had thrown her, still alive, from the railroad trestle bridge to be smashed on the rocks below. It was a terrible way for anyone to die, let alone an innocent little girl. And the autopsy would only add to the traumatic picture that the authorities were able to paint of Shauna's final hours. The child had been subjected to a brutal rape, possibly by more than one perpetrator. The news of Shauna Howe's savage murder spread terror through the quiet community of Oil City. Residents had always considered this a good place to live, a safe place to raise children. Now, that sense of security was shattered. A monster had emerged on Halloween night to snuff out a little girl's life and traumatize an entire town. Doors and windows that had once stood open were now locked. Children who had played on the streets or in the park were now kept indoors. The city council passed an ordinance that banned trick-or-treating after dark. It would remain in place for the next decade. And during all that time, the killer of Shauna Howe remained at large, unpunished for his terrible crime. But for advances in DNA technology, he would likely have remained so. In 1995, a long-term Oil City resident named James O'Brien was arrested for attempting to kidnap a woman by forcing her into the trunk of his car. O'Brien was well known to law enforcement. He and his brother Tim were a pair of lowlifes who were perpetually in trouble on charges ranging from car theft to Social Security fraud. They also had a propensity for sexually motivated attacks on women. In fact, the O'Brien brothers had been briefly considered as suspects at the time of Shauna Howe's murder, but had been eliminated due to an administrative error. The investigating officer had mistakenly believed they were in jail on the night that Shauna died. James had ended up in prison 3 years later on the attempted kidnapping charge. Now, in 2002, he was required to submit a DNA sample. The minute his profile was entered into the state database, there was a hit to the seminal fluid that had been lifted from Shauna's leotard. The DNA match injected new impetus into the investigation, with both the FBI and the Pennsylvania State Police involved. But the cops weren't ready to act just yet. They were certain that James O'Brien had not acted alone. Following that line of inquiry soon turned up the name of one of their earliest suspects, Eldred Walker, a known associate of the O'Brien brothers. Walker was questioned again, and his home was subjected to another search. During that process, he made some incriminating statements, saying that he'd allowed some really bad people to use his house for a disgusting thing. Pressed on this, he admitted that he was talking about James and Tim O'Brien and the rape and murder of Shauna Howe. Eldred Walker was later offered a plea deal, allowing him to plead to kidnapping and third-degree murder in exchange for his testimony against the O'Briens. According to Walker, he and the brothers had been out cruising that Halloween night and had decided to play a prank. They were going to drag some kid off the street to give him or her a scare. It was at that moment that they spotted Shauna, and James told him to get her. Walker then got out of the car and grabbed Shauna, passing her to the brothers who were waiting in the vehicle. He expected them to let her go, but instead they told him to drive back to his house. There, they dragged Shauna to an upstairs bedroom, while Walker remained downstairs. A short while later, she started screaming. At that time, Walker said, he went upstairs and told them to leave. This they did, taking Shauna with them. She was still alive when she left his house, Walker insisted. Putting aside the obviously self-serving nature of Walker's narrative, the police believed that it was mainly true. Walker, they knew, had not raped the girl. His DNA had not been found on her body, and they also knew that Shauna had not died inside his house. The child had still been alive when she was thrown from the bridge. Walker, in any case, was going away for a very long time. His plea deal specified a 40-year jail term. Now, it was time for the law to deal with the main perpetrators. Eldred Walker would be the key prosecution witness at their September 2006 trial. James and Tim O'Brien had been frequent visitors to the Indiana County Courthouse during their adult lives. Almost always they'd appeared here as defendants, but never had they faced charges as serious as the ones now before them: first-degree murder, rape, kidnapping, conspiracy to commit each of the aforementioned crimes. In spite of the evidence against them, the brothers entered not guilty pleas. DNA and the testimony of their co-accused made liars of them. Oddly, the brothers were acquitted of first-degree murder, but convicted on second- and third-degree murder charges. They were found guilty of kidnapping, but acquitted of rape. It mattered not to the sentence, though. Both were sent to prison for life with no possibility of parole. Never again will they be free to harm a child. Footnote: in 2008, the Oil City Council finally lifted its ban on after-dark trick-or-treating. The prohibition had been in place for 15 years. Your sins will find you. It is a scene straight out of everyone's worst nightmare. You arrive home to find someone hiding in your house, an intruder with a gun in his hand and evil intent in his heart. The man holds his weapon on you and warns you not to try anything stupid. He regards you with the cold eyes of a reptile, then orders you to turn around and drop to your knees. The floorboard creaks as he steps up behind you. You can hear his breath and smell his sour body odor. Your life, in this moment, hinges on the whim of his will. On the evening of January 9th, 1972, this nightmare, this terrible primal fear, became reality for a middle-aged African-American couple, Jackson and Daisy Schley. Jackson and Daisy had returned from a shopping trip that night and had treated themselves to ice cream, which they planned to eat in front of the television. They'd barely entered their home, on the 900 block of 20th Avenue in Seattle, when a man emerged from the shadows holding a gun. He forced the couple to their knees and then fired without warning, hitting 58-year-old Jackson twice in the back of the head. Daisy had barely had time to comprehend what had happened when the man grabbed her by the neck and pushed her face to the floor beside her dying husband. Holding her there, he reached into Jackson's pocket and removed his wallet. Then he yanked Daisy to her feet again and dragged her outside at gunpoint, forcing her into his car. Daisy was incapable of resisting. For her, this night of terror had only just begun. The man who had invaded the Schleys' home, who'd murdered Jackson and dragged his wife off to an uncertain fate, was named Samuel Evans. He was 38 years old and had spent his entire adult life in and out of prison. Daisy would not have known that, of course, but she must have known that she was in mortal danger. Still numb from the shock of losing her husband, she was driven to a remote spot where Evans ordered her to remove her clothes and then raped her. Having sated himself, he then told her to get dressed again and drove her to another location, where he told her to get out of the vehicle. The 46-year-old woman was then savagely attacked, beaten unconscious with the assailant's fists and with the gun butt. He then fired at her, although the bullet missed and only grazed her skull. Apparently believing that his victim was dead, Evans then left. Only Daisy Schley wasn't dead. Sometime later, she regained consciousness and staggered to her feet. She was in great pain, blood streaming from a head wound, her eyes swollen, almost shut. She also had no idea where she was. Some remote area, heavily overgrown, densely treed. The only sign of life was a light in the distance. She started towards it, every step an agony. Fortunately for Daisy, the owner of the property was home and heard her cries. He helped her inside and then called the police. Daisy would later describe her husband's killer as a tall, slim black man with shoulder-length hair and a beard and mustache. After overseeing her husband's funeral, she moved to Texas to live with her children. She was still living there in 2007 when she passed at age 81. Sadly, she'd never seen justice done. Despite the best efforts of the police, the man who'd killed her beloved Jackson, who'd raped her and beaten her and left her for dead, had gone unpunished. But that was not due to a lack of effort on the part of the Seattle PD. In the 38 years that the case remained unsolved, successive generations of detectives had taken a crack at it, hoping to unearth some clue that previous investigators might have missed. The case was far from forgotten, and on July 15, 2005, there was finally a break. The State Crime Lab had been processing evidence from another cold case, the 1968 stabbing of James Kuehler in the Seattle suburb of Madrona. Cigarette butts had been found at the scene, and now the lab was able to extract a DNA profile. Entered into the system, it provided a match. The man who'd killed James Kuehler was also the killer of Jackson Schley. The only problem was that there was no matching suspect in the state database. The reason that there was no match was simple. Over the previous 2 decades, Samuel Evans had been confined to a prison cell in Nevada, incarcerated for another violent rape, committed in Las Vegas in July 1987. On that occasion, Evans had attacked and violated a 66-year-old woman who'd had the misfortune of hiring him as a gardener. He'd then left the victim tied up and fled in her 1977 Oldsmobile, taking her cash and credit cards. He'd finally been apprehended in Denver and brought back to Nevada to stand trial. Looking at a potential life sentence, he'd been allowed to plead out. He would eventually be paroled in 2009, by which time he was 72 years old and in poor health. Had Evans remained in Nevada for whatever time he had left on this earth, he might well have escaped retribution for the murders of Jackson Schley and James Kuehler. But Evans decided that he wanted to see out the rest of his days in Everett, Washington. That meant that he'd have to register as a convicted sex offender with the local authorities, and part of that process involved providing a biological sample for DNA testing. Evans, as a career criminal and ex-con, should have known the consequences when he allowed the inside of his mouth to be swabbed. His DNA profile was entered into the state database, where it immediately found a match. Seattle PD had their man at last. In late 2010, Seattle cold case detective Mike Szynski knocked at the door of a halfway house in Everett. The man who answered was a long way removed from the menacing individual who had confronted Jackson and Daisy Schley in their home all those years ago. He was frail, relying on a cane or a motorized scooter to get around. He walked with a pronounced stoop and complained of a variety of ailments. He was also adamant about one thing. He wasn't the man who'd invaded the Schley residence, who'd shot Jackson and raped his wife, Daisy. Unfortunately for Evans, the evidence said different. The DNA extracted from the semen found on Daisy Schley's clothes was his. That meant that he was the man who'd raped her, and by extension, the man who'd shot her husband. He could no longer be charged with rape since the statute had long expired, but there is no statute of limitations on murder. Taken into custody, he was brought back to Seattle to face charges. Samuel Evans made a big deal of playing up his age and infirmity at his May 2011 trial. If you were unaware of his long criminal history, you would probably have felt sorry for him. But this was no frail old man. This was a monster who had destroyed just about every life he'd touched. Aside from the murder of Jackson Schley and the rapes of Daisy and of the elderly Las Vegas victim, there was the murder of James Kuehler, knifed to death in his own home. Evans had also been convicted of the shooting death of a Denver man in 1977 and was linked to the rape and murder of a woman in Pasco, Washington in the 1970s. That makes him a serial killer. As if that were not enough, Evans had served 8 prison terms between 1972 and 1987 when he was sent down for the Las Vegas rape. He'd spent 39 of his last 50 years behind bars. Clearly, this was an individual who represented a significant danger to society. And now, thanks to the wonders of DNA, Evans would finally be made to pay for destroying the lives of Jackson and Daisy Schley. He entered Alford pleas to 2 counts of manslaughter at his 2011 trial and was sentenced to 20 years in prison. At his advanced age and poor state of health, it was effectively a life sentence. Samuel Evans died behind bars in 2018. As the good book says in Numbers 23, your sins will find you. Broken Wings. Ever since she was a teenager, Nancy Ludwig had only ever wanted to do one thing. She wanted to be a flight attendant. And this was a career to which the attractive brunette was perfectly suited. Nancy was bubbly and outgoing, friendly, compassionate, a real people person. Those in her inner circle also said that she had a sense of adventure and a wicked sense of humor. Those were traits that would carry her through 2 decades of service, aboard flights that brought her to all corners of the globe. By the 1990s, though, the 41-year-old Nancy was no longer working those long hauls. Tonight, she'd be making the relatively short hop from her hometown of Minneapolis to Detroit, Michigan. Nancy's husband, Art, always insisted on dropping her off at the airport when she was working, and the frigid night of Sunday, February 17th, 1991, was no different. At 57, Art was 16 years older than his wife. But that age gap was no impediment to a happy marriage. Friends described them as the perfect couple. Tonight, as she kissed her husband goodbye, Nancy made her usual promise, that she'd call him after she landed. Since this was a late-night flight, she would be staying over in Detroit and returning the next day. At around 11 a.m. the next morning, a maid knocked on the door of Nancy Ludwig's room at the Hilton Airport Inn in Romulus, Michigan. Getting no response, she announced, "Room service," and then entered, using her key card. The drapes were still drawn, so she crossed the room and opened them. Then she turned towards the bed. What she saw there had her running for the door, barely stifling a scream. Not even bothering to wait for the elevator, she took the stairs, descending them 3 steps at a time. Minutes later, she arrived at the hotel security office and breathlessly announced that the guest in room 354 had suffered a miscarriage. It is easy to understand why the maid would have reached that conclusion. Nancy Ludwig lay on her back in the bed with a blood-drenched sheet pulled up to her chin. But this was no failed pregnancy. When the hotel detective peeled back the sheet, he saw immediately the horrible injury that had been inflicted on the victim. Nancy's throat had been cut from ear to ear. She had almost been decapitated. The first task in any homicide investigation is to establish the identity of the victim. In this case, that should have been easy. The room was registered to Nancy Ludwig of Minneapolis. However, as detectives looked for verification of that ID, they came up against a roadblock. All of the victim's personal belongings, her purse, her luggage, even her Northwest Airlines uniform, were gone, presumably taken by the killer. So what was the motive for the murder? Was this a robbery? Semen stains on the sheets said different. This appeared to be a particularly vicious sex crime. Just how vicious would soon be confirmed by the Wayne County medical examiner. Cause of death was determined to be blood loss due to the slitting of the victim's throat. The cut that had caused this injury ran so deep that the knife had left notches on the spinal column. But even that told only part of the story. Nancy Ludwig had suffered numerous cuts all over her body. These were shallow incisions, and the ME could only assume that they had been inflicted as a form of torture. Nancy had also sustained horrendous defensive injuries to her hands. It appeared that she'd tried to grab the blade and that the killer had yanked it away, almost severing her fingers. The crime scene also yielded semen and blood samples, which were sent for analysis. Back in Minneapolis, Art Ludwig was becoming increasingly concerned about his wife. Nancy hadn't called him as promised, and that was not like her. They had a set routine, and Nancy had never broken it in all of their years together. Art was just contemplating calling the airline or the hotel when the phone jangled into life. Relieved, he picked it up, only it wasn't Nancy on the line. It was her supervisor. She told him that there was a police officer waiting outside and that he should go talk to him. He should also get a flight to Detroit. Art knew that something terrible had happened to his precious Nancy. Within the next minute, the life that he knew would be totally and utterly destroyed. And so Art flew out to Detroit to officially identify the desecrated remains of his beloved wife. As if that were not hard enough, he also found himself hauled into an interrogation room and faced down by two grim-faced detectives. This is standard procedure in a homicide inquiry. Detectives tend to start with the victim and work out from there. Those closest are usually the first suspects. However, it was quite obvious that Art had nothing to do with his wife's death. Quite aside from the fact that he'd been 700 miles away at the time of the murder, the man was distraught, broken. He was soon struck from the suspect list. That left police with possibly the hardest type of homicide to solve, the stranger killing. Beginning at ground zero, they began working the hotel, going door to door. Soon, they'd uncover two sightings of a potential suspect. The first was from a hotel employee who reported that he'd seen a man hanging around in the stairwell. The man had looked out of place, he said, and seemed agitated. This same individual, described as medium build, with short, thick hair and eyeglasses, was spotted by another witness, a flight attendant who was running up and down the stairs as a workout. She said that the man was standing in the third-floor stairwell and that he had creeped her out. Regrettably, the hotel's security system did not cover the residential floors, so the police could not get a more detailed description of their suspect. However, they did hear from another flight attendant who said that he'd been awakened by noises that he thought might be muted screams. He'd gone out into the corridor to investigate, but then the screams had stopped, and so he'd gone back to bed. All of this helped investigators create a reconstruction of the crime. They believed that the killer had been lurking in the stairwell, waiting for Nancy to arrive and open her door. When she did, he came up behind her and forced her inside. There, he would have been able to carry out his perverted desires without fear of interference. According to the medical examiner, he'd either raped Nancy as she lay dying or after she was already dead. This was a case that Detroit PD desperately wanted to close, and quickly. The perpetrator of this savage, ritualistic crime was very likely to do it again. Thus far, though, the investigation was coming up against a brick wall. Then, a few days in, there was a meaningful break at last. A flight attendant came forward to report something he'd seen on the night of the murder. He said that he'd been looking out of his window at the Hilton when he spotted a man bundling a suitcase and a Northwest Airlines uniform into the trunk of a red-brown Chevy Monte Carlo. The man matched the description of the individual seen earlier in the stairwell of the hotel, leading investigators to conclude that he was likely the killer they were hunting. This was a significant break, and the police soon began distributing an identikit of the suspect and a picture of his car. With the case now receiving widespread coverage in the media, this was widely distributed and soon began generating leads. One tip-off led to an individual who frequently dressed in a Northwest pilot's uniform and claimed to fly for the airline. He turned out to be a creep who used the ruse to pick up gullible women. Another tip came from a man who got in contact with Art Ludwig directly, saying that he had information about Nancy's death. Art agreed to meet with him, but the outcome was disappointing. The man turned out to be a conspiracy theorist who claimed that Nancy had been killed by Russian agents. And with that, the investigation began to run into trouble. A search for the suspect's car on motor vehicle records drew a blank, and so too did a $25,000 reward offered by Northwest Airlines for information. Eventually, Art Ludwig became so frustrated with the lack of progress that he started his own investigation. He fared no better than the police. Despite the committed efforts of everyone involved, the case went cold. In 2001, 10 years after the murder of Nancy Ludwig, the Detroit Police Department received a federal grant to investigate some of the cold cases on its books. Since there was a semen sample in the Ludwig case, it was a prime candidate for this type of initiative. The sample was sent for DNA analysis and returned an immediate match, not to a suspect, but to another unsolved homicide. Margaret Eby, a music professor at the University of Michigan, had been butchered in her home on the Mott estate in Flint in November 1986. The case had remarkable similarities to that of Nancy Ludwig. Professor Eby had been tortured with dozens of small cuts to her skin. Her throat had been slashed. She had been raped. In the Eby case, though, there was an additional clue, a partial fingerprint left on a faucet. At the time of the murder, the police had been unable to find a match. Now they resubmitted it and got a hit to a man named Jeffrey Wayne Gorton. On the face of it, Gorton made an unlikely murder suspect. The 39-year-old was married with 2 kids and employed in his family's landscaping business. He had no police record. As investigators delved deeper, though, they made an interesting discovery. Gorton had done 6 months in a military prison in 1985 while serving in the U.S. Navy. He'd then been dishonorably discharged. His crime? Multiple counts of stealing women's underwear and 1 of assault. In the assault case, Gorton had knocked down a naval officer, ripped off her shirt, and run away with it. These crimes had been committed when Gorton was in his early 20s, but they established a pattern. Gorton obviously had a fetish. The question was whether that fetish had led him eventually to murder. There was only one way to find out. They needed a sample of his DNA. And so Gorton was placed under 24-hour surveillance, with detectives following him to a skating rink where he'd taken his 2 children. There, officers watched as he drank a soda from a paper cup and then used a napkin. Both of these items were later retrieved and sent to the lab for DNA extraction and comparison. It was a match. It was time for investigators to have a conversation with Jeffrey Wayne Gorton. Gorton readily agreed to come down to the station to answer questions when DPD detectives called at his home. While that interrogation was underway, officers carried out a search of his residence. Here, they would uncover a treasure trove of evidence. In the garage, under a tarp, was a red-brown Chevy Monte Carlo, exactly like the one seen near the Ludwig crime scene. In the attic, they found a huge stash of women's underwear, hundreds of items, some of them labeled with the names of the original owners. And then there was the collection of VHS tapes. Gorton, it seemed, had rigged a hidden camera in the bathroom of his home and had been secretly filming guests and family members. On some of the other tapes were images of Gorton himself, dressed in women's underwear and posing for the camera. Nothing in this haul of evidence linked back to the Ludwig or Eby murders, but prosecutors already had enough to make their case. With Gorton in custody, a search warrant was obtained for his DNA. This was again compared to the semen from the crime scenes and again returned a match. Jeffrey Gorton was then arrested and charged with 2 counts of murder. But one question still remained unanswered. Why had Gorton targeted these 2 women for death? It turned out that Nancy and Margaret were just unlucky. Theirs was a case of wrong place, wrong time. Gorton was an opportunistic killer. In Margaret's case, he had been installing a sprinkler system on the Mott estate where she lived. Nancy Ludwig had been unfortunate to be allocated the room that was directly across from the stairwell where he was lying in wait for a victim. On such small margins do the wheels of fate turn. Tried and found guilty of the murder of Nancy Ludwig, Jeffrey Gorton was sentenced to a term of 40 to 80 years in prison. In the Eby trial, he entered a plea of no contest and received a life term. The Michigan police have not, thus far, linked him to any other unsolved homicides. It would not be a surprise if there are other victims, though. Jeffrey Wayne Gorton fits all of the criteria for a serial killer. Justice for Jessica. Jessica Keene was not the first teenager to take a detour on the road to adulthood, and she certainly won't be the last. There had been a time when the attractive 15-year-old was an honor student, a cheerleader, a girl of whom great things were expected. But then, Jessica fell for an 18-year-old high school dropout named Sean Thompson, and everything changed. Sean was the proverbial bad influence. Suddenly, Jessica was skipping school, quitting the cheerleading team, flunking tests. Her grades plummeted, and she no longer seemed interested in going to college and fulfilling her dream of becoming a zoologist. Nothing her parents did or said made any difference. When they forbade her from seeing Sean, she snuck out of the house and hung out with him anyway. When they threatened to ground her, she told them that she would run away. The situation was getting desperate. As a last resort, Jessica's mom decided to send her to a 2-week residential counseling program. This was at a center for troubled teens called Huckleberry House, situated in their hometown of Columbus, Ohio. Jessica began the program on March 3, 1991, and was due to return home on March 17th. But a day before her departure, she got a call from Sean. He and some friends were in Florida, and he wanted Jessica to hop on a bus and join them there. Jessica said that she couldn't, resulting in a shouting match that was heard by everyone at the center. At the end of it, Jessica told Sean that it was over and slammed down the phone. She left the counseling center a short while later, telling a friend that she was going to the mall. According to the friend, she was in tears and very upset. Jessica was last seen sitting at a bus stop across the street from Huckleberry House. It was 6 o'clock in the evening. No one saw her board a bus. Jessica Keene did not return to the center that night, and she was still not home by the following morning. The staff then called her parents, who called the police. Initially, it was thought that she might have run away. She'd threatened to do so before. Perhaps she'd decided to meet up with Sean in Florida after all. But that theory would be proved tragically wrong 42 hours later when the teenager's battered corpse was found at Foster Chapel Cemetery in West Jefferson, some 20 miles from where she'd last been seen. Jessica was naked, clad only in a bra and one sock. She had suffered horrendous head injuries. The weapon used to club her to death was found near the body. It was a granite tombstone, wielded with so much force that it had broken in two. An autopsy would confirm what investigators already knew. This was a sex crime. Jessica Keene had been savagely raped. The theory of the crime, developed by the Madison County Sheriff's Office, was that Jessica had been abducted from the bus stop and taken to some unknown location, where she was restrained and repeatedly raped. A strip of duct tape, still attached to her wrist, supported that premise. At some point, it seems she'd escaped her assailant and made a run for it. Knee impressions found among the gravestones suggested that she'd hidden there. However, the killer had found her and beaten her to death. Who would have done such a thing? The answer, tragically, was that it might have been any one of the myriad psychos that prey on the weak and vulnerable. However, police attention was initially focused on Sean Thompson, the dumped boyfriend who'd had such a vicious argument with Jessica on the day she died. Thompson returned from his Florida vacation to find himself hauled into an interrogation room. Unfortunately for the police, he had an unbreakable alibi. He'd been 1,200 miles away, on the other side of the country, when Jessica was killed. The police asked him to provide a sample for DNA testing anyway. Thompson complied willingly, and so did all of his friends. None of them was a match to the seminal fluid lifted from the murdered girl. And none of the other leads that the police pursued checked out either. No one had seen Jessica taken from the bus stop. No one had seen her running naked through the West Jefferson churchyard. No one came forward with any tip-off as to the identity of the killer. Despite the best efforts of the police, the investigation sputtered and stalled. It ended up eventually among the nearly 40% of murders that go unsolved in the United States. But of course, that number is shrinking. The advances made in DNA technology make it ever more difficult for a killer to get away with murder, even one committed decades ago. In 2004, a habitual criminal named Marvin Lee Smith, Jr. was paroled from his latest stint as a guest of the country's judicial system. This time, it was for sexually assaulting 2 Columbus women, but this was hardly Smith's first rodeo. He'd previously served time for robbery, kidnapping, and rape. As a condition of his parole, Smith was required to provide a DNA sample for entry into the state and national systems. Thereafter, he moved to North Carolina. He was still living there when the law caught up with him. Extradited to Ohio to face charges of aggravated murder, kidnapping, and rape, Smith was in a perilous situation. The prosecutor had made no bones about it. This was a case that warranted the ultimate penalty. Given the heinous nature of the crime, it was very likely that a jury would agree. And Smith could hardly claim innocence. His DNA nailed him as the man who'd raped Jessica Keene and beaten her to death. Smith therefore asked for a deal, a guilty plea and a full confession in exchange for life in prison. The cost of running a capital murder trial, of convicting a man and then spending the next several decades navigating the appeals process, is prohibitively expensive, running to millions of dollars. Prosecutors are therefore inclined to listen when a defendant offers a guilty plea, especially when that plea will put him behind bars for life. In the matter of Marvin Lee Smith, the state had a very winnable case. They could easily have put Smith on death row. But what then? Given the exhaustive appeals process, Smith was more likely to die of natural causes than by the needle. It was therefore decided to accept the plea offer. This is how we know what happened to Jessica Keene during her dreadful final hours. According to Smith, he'd spotted the pretty teenager sitting alone at the bus stop in Wineland Park. It was twilight, and the street was deserted. For a predator like Smith, it was too good an opportunity to pass up. Using the age-old ruse of asking for directions, Smith had approached. Jessica, still upset over her fight with her boyfriend, realized the danger too late when Smith suddenly snaked out a hand and grabbed her by the throat. Lack of oxygen incapacitated her and cut off her ability to call out. She was dragged into Smith's car and driven away to a terrible fate. Looking for a remote spot where they would not be disturbed, Smith eventually pulled under the cover of some trees near the Foster Chapel Cemetery in West Jefferson. Here, he bound the terrified teenager's hands with duct tape and ripped off her clothes. Jessica was then viciously violated, subjected to a rape that continued intermittently for several hours. Eventually, her attacker dozed off, and that was when Jessica seized her chance, jumping from the vehicle and fleeing into the nearby churchyard. Smith followed, but Jessica had a start on him. In the pitch dark, with plenty of cover behind the gravestones, he was unable to find her. He was just about to leave when Jessica made a tragic and fatal mistake. She decided to make a run for it, not realizing that a fence loomed just ahead of her in the darkness. She hit the barrier at full tilt and was thrown back, winded, onto the ground. That was when Smith caught up to her, picked up the 70-pound headstone, and brought it crashing down on her head. By the time he was done, Jessica's skull had been reduced to a mess of splintered bone and bloodied brain matter. Marvin Smith told this tale with no discernible remorse for the young life he'd destroyed. He was equally dispassionate when the sentence of the court was handed down, life in prison. Surprisingly, the DA had not insisted on a no-parole condition in the plea deal. Smith could, theoretically, walk free after serving 30 years. Given his age and his extensive history of violent crime, it is far more likely that he will die behind bars. After 17 years, there was justice for Jessica at last. Attack of the Killer Clown. It was one of the most bizarre murders that investigators in Palm Beach County had ever encountered. At around 10:45 a.m., on the morning of May 26, 1990, someone dressed in a clown costume, an orange wig, red nose, and white makeup knocked on the door of a residence in the upscale Aero Club community in Wellington, Florida. 40-year-old Marlene Warren went to answer and found the clown on her doorstep clutching a bouquet of flowers and holding a couple of helium-filled balloons suspended on a string. Marlene had barely had the opportunity to say anything when the clown raised a pistol, held it at point-blank range, and pulled the trigger, hitting Marlene in the face. The clown then walked casually to a white Chrysler LeBaron parked at the curb, got in, and drove away. Marlene Warren was found moments later by other occupants of the house. She was alive, but unconscious when she reached the hospital. She died 2 days later, without ever waking up. Suspects in this cold-blooded execution were not hard to find. Just 2 hours after the shooting, the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Department received an anonymous call from a female tipster advising them to check out Michael Warren and Sheila Keene. Warren was the victim's husband. Keene was an employee at his car dealership, Bargain Motors, in West Palm Beach. The word on the wire was that they were having an affair. But that was explicitly denied by Sheila Keene. According to Sheila, her relationship with Mike Warren was strictly employer-employee. He owned the car lot. She was his repo lady. That also accounted for Sheila's alibi. At the time of the shooting, she'd been out repossessing a car. Michael Warren was equally emphatic when asked to account for his whereabouts. At the moment that his wife was gunned down, Warren was on his way to a race meeting at Calder Racecourse in Miami Gardens. Several of his friends were able to verify this, but that did not put Warren in the clear. A man of his means could easily have hired an assassin, or he could have got his lover, Sheila Keene, to do the dirty work because, despite their denials, the police were now certain that the pair were romantically involved. Several Bargain Motors employees had seen them kissing and cuddling. There were also rumors of discord in the Warren marriage. That gave them motive. Over the weeks that followed, the police focused their investigative efforts almost exclusively on the car lot lovers, and the evidence soon began to stack up against them. Several eyewitnesses had seen the clown approaching the Warren residence. All of them described a slim individual of around 5'8", clutching balloons and flowers in one hand and a pistol in the other. More than one witness stated that the suspect had man-like features, but moved like a woman. All of these descriptors matched Sheila Keene. And then there was the clerk at a West Palm Beach store who picked Keene out of a photo array as the woman who'd purchased a clown costume 2 days before the slaying. 2 Publix employees also pointed to Keene as the individual who'd bought balloons and flowers just 90 minutes before the shooting. The balloons were quite distinctive. One had the inscription, "You're the greatest," the other had a picture of Snow White on it. These matched the inflatables that eyewitnesses had seen in the hands of the killer clown. That particular piece of evidence gave the police probable cause for a search warrant on Sheila Keene's apartment. They were hoping for a slam dunk, perhaps the clown costume or the murder weapon. They didn't find those, but what they did find was compelling. Orange wig fibers that matched those lifted from the interior of the getaway vehicle. The white Chrysler LeBaron had been found in a Winn-Dixie parking lot 4 days after the shooting and had been impounded by the police. It had also given up another vital clue, a long strand of hair with the root still attached. The investigative team had hoped to obtain a DNA profile from this biological material, but regrettably, the technology of the day was not up to the task. But the fibers were a different matter. To investigators, this was the missing link, the piece of evidence that connected Sheila Keene with the disguise worn by the killer. Unfortunately, the DA saw things differently. Without the original wig to match the fibers to, the lead was tenuous at best. A smart defense attorney could easily explain it away. It wasn't enough to make the case for murder. With nowhere else to take their inquiries, the investigation soon ran into trouble after that. Eventually, it went cold, with the evidence boxed up and stashed away in the dark reaches of an evidence closet. It would remain there for the next 2 decades. For Michael Warren, though, the inquiry into his wife's death would have some unfortunate consequences. It shone a light on his business dealings and sparked a whole new investigation, this one into racketeering, grand theft, and odometer fraud. Eventually convicted on 43 charges, Warren was sentenced to 3 years in prison. During his incarceration, the woman who had denied having an affair with him wrote every day, fervently declaring her love. When he was released in 1997, the pair fell off the radar for a time, re-emerging 5 years later in Las Vegas, where they tied the knot. The couple then moved to Abingdon, Virginia, and opened the Purple Cow restaurant across the state line in Kingsport, Tennessee. There, Sheila often enjoyed a drink with her employees after work. They described her as a fun person to socialize with, but hell on wheels on the job. Sheila, it appears, had a temper. Sheila Keene, the one-time repo lady and murder suspect, had got her man after all. She and Michael settled down to life in Virginia, oblivious to the fact that a clock was ticking on their domestic bliss. In a dusty box, sitting on a shelf in an evidence room in Palm Beach County, payback was waiting. In 2014, the Sheriff's Department applied for a federal grant to reopen the Warren case and was awarded $125,000. A task force was then established, which included members of the state attorney's office and the FBI. The first step was to re-interview witnesses, and the investigators got down to that right away. However, it was always going to be the forensic evidence that cracked the case. DNA technologies had come a long way since 2002. Back then, technicians had been unable to lift a DNA profile from the strand of hair found inside the getaway vehicle. Now, such a match was easily obtained. The hair belonged to Sheila Keene Warren. Finally, the chain of circumstantial evidence could be tied together. Sheila had been inside the vehicle. So too had fibers from the clown wig, the same fibers that had been found inside her home. The obvious conclusion was that it had been Sheila who'd worn the clown disguise, she who'd approached the house, bearing gifts in one hand and a gun in the other. It was Sheila Keene Warren who eyewitnesses had seen getting into the stolen Chrysler LeBaron and driving away after the shooting. It was Sheila Keene Warren who'd pulled the trigger and ended the life of her rival. It simply could not have been anyone else. Sheila Keene Warren was indicted for murder in August 2017 and extradited to Florida, where she was held without bail. And the stakes could hardly have been higher for the accused murderer. Prosecutors were treating this as a capital case. Later, the threat of the death penalty would be removed from the table, but Keene Warren still faces the prospect of life without parole if convicted. The case was due to come before a jury in 2020, but was delayed due to the coronavirus pandemic. At the time of writing, it has yet to be heard. One chilling detail would emerge while Sheila Warren waited on her day in court. According to Sheila's employees at the Purple Cow, she had a favorite costume that she liked to drag out at Halloween. She liked to dress as a clown. Haunted. On the afternoon of March 16th, 1982, 13-year-old Carrie Ann Jopek was caught cutting classes at Kosciuszko Middle School in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. The school had a zero-tolerance policy for this sort of thing, and so Carrie Ann was given an immediate suspension and sent home with a note for her parents. Not that the punishment bothered Carrie much. This was exactly what she'd planned when she'd gone walking the halls during class. The suspension would allow her to head to her friend Robin Mant's house. Robin was throwing a party that afternoon, attended by over a dozen kids who were all skipping school. This was going to be fun. We know that Carrie Ann attended the party that day because several of her friends saw her there. No one saw her leave, but it was just assumed that she'd snuck out at some point and gone home. Only Carrie didn't make it home that afternoon, and she still had not returned well into the evening. That was when her mom, Carolyn, started working the phones, calling her daughter's friends, trying to track her down. None of them professed to have seen Carrie Ann at any time beyond mid-afternoon. By 10 p.m., Carolyn had called the police and reported her daughter missing. She was up front with the officers, offering the opinion that Carrie Ann had probably run away, perhaps to avoid the consequences of her suspension. In the vast majority of teenage runaway cases, the errant child is quickly located or returns of his or her own volition within a few hours. That was not how it played out with Carrie Ann Jopek. Days turned into weeks, turned into months, with no trace of the missing teen. For Carrie Ann's family, this was a terrible time, a time of angst and longing. Where was Carrie Ann? Was she all right? Was she being cared for? Was she being mistreated? Held prisoner somewhere? Was she even alive? The answers to all of these questions would continue to plague the family over the next 17 months, until the fateful morning of September 2nd, 1983, when a carpenter started work on constructing a new back porch at the Mant residence. The contractor began by demolishing the old structure. Then he started digging the foundation holes for the new. That was when he found the skeleton, a pile of bones dressed in jeans and a t-shirt. 4 days later, its identity would be known. Carrie Ann Jopek was identified using dental records. An autopsy would reveal that she had died of head and neck injuries, which caused bleeding on her brain. And so, one mystery was resolved, the mystery of where Carrie Ann Jopek had been all this time. Now, the police had another to unravel. How had she ended up buried under the porch, and who had put her there? The obvious answer was that it was someone who had attended the party that day. One guest, in particular, was brought to the attention of the police. On the day that Carrie Ann's remains were removed to the morgue, a young man named Jose Ferreira showed up at the site. Ferreira was spotted by a neighbor, standing beside the ominous hole in the ground. He was highly agitated and appeared to be crying. He was also holding his hands towards the heavens, as though addressing God directly. Brought in for questioning, Ferreira admitted that he'd been at the party that day, but denied spending time with Carrie Ann or even knowing her. As for his overt display of emotion in the backyard, Ferreira said that he was just showing compassion for a young girl who died and shouldn't have died. The police had no reason to detain him. He was allowed to leave. In truth, this was a crime that the police had very little chance of solving. Months had passed. Valuable time had been lost. Evidence had degraded. The witnesses, such as they were, had been drunk and stoned and had hazy recollections of that afternoon. Many of them could not even recall whether Carrie Ann had been at the party. Without ever really gaining traction, the investigation ground to a halt. The murder of Carrie Ann Jopek would remain unsolved for the next 3 decades. And then, over the course of one extraordinary afternoon in October 2015, the truth would all come out, gushing like water from a Yellowstone geyser. That was the day that Jose Ferreira, the same Jose Ferreira who'd once been questioned in connection with Carrie Ann Jopek's death, called his estranged wife and said that he had something to confess. Jose was drunk, slurring his words as he spoke. What he had to say, though, had nothing to do with his inebriated state. The story he had to tell was extraordinary. Immediately after hanging up the phone, his wife went to her car and drove to the West Milwaukee police station. There, she told the desk sergeant that she wanted to report a murder. The police were still taking down that statement when they received another call, reporting the same crime. This one was from a counselor working a crisis hotline. She said that a man named Jose had called her and confessed to killing a teenaged girl 30 years ago when he was still a teen himself. Worryingly, he'd ended the conversation by telling the counselor that he might just decide to go out in a blaze of glory. That piece of information had officers scrambling to bring Jose Ferreira into custody. Ferreira, meanwhile, was still in a confessional mood. His next call was to Milwaukee news station WISN 12, where he told a reporter much the same story as he'd revealed to the crisis counselor. Back in 1982, he said, when he was 17 years old, he'd killed a girl named Carrie Ann Jopek. "I didn't mean to do it," he sniffled. "It was an accident." Jose Ferreira would offer the same story to investigators when he was taken into custody 2 days later. He said that he'd spotted Carrie Ann the minute she arrived at the party and had thought she was pretty. He'd been drinking heavily, he said, and had also smoked some marijuana. Crossing the room, he'd approached Carrie Ann and offered her a pull on his joint, which she accepted. He then asked if she wanted to go down to the basement with him, and she said yes. However, as they stepped onto the landing, Carrie Ann had second thoughts. "I don't know if this is a good idea," she told him. Ferreira then grabbed her by the arm and told her that he wasn't going to let her back out now, He gave her a push to get her moving. Instead, she lost her footing and fell, striking her head on the banister on the way down, landing at the bottom of the stairs in a heap. According to Ferreira, he thought that she'd been knocked out cold. Deciding to take advantage of the situation, he started fondling the girl. It was only when he tried removing her clothes that he realized she wasn't breathing. Panicked, uncertain what to do, he'd eventually decided to pull her through the basement window and bury her under the porch. Asked why he had decided to come forward now, after all these years, Ferreira said that he could no longer live with the guilt. He believed that Carrie Ann was haunting him, he said, forcing him to admit his sin. It would later emerge that Ferreira had befriended the Jopek family after Carrie Ann's body was found. He'd started by visiting their house to offer his condolences. Thereafter, he'd show up out of the blue and sit at the kitchen table, saying nothing. On one occasion, he blurted out that he knew who had killed Carrie, but couldn't say for fear of his life. No amount of pressing could get him to reveal more. But whatever remorse he might have felt, however much he felt haunted by the ghost of Carrie Ann, Ferreira was still going to try to escape responsibility for his actions. As the matter headed for trial, his attorney made it clear that they would challenge the confession and offer up an alternate suspect, believed to be Robin Matt's older brother, John. He had a witness, he said, who had been at the party and would finger John as the killer. Prosecutors would later learn that this witness was Robin Matt's ex-boyfriend, currently serving a jail term and angling for a reduction of sentence. In most other cases, such evidence would have been easily dismissed. In this one, it would have to be carefully considered. The case against Ferreira was weak, with no forensics, no eyewitnesses, nothing, in fact, but the confession. If the judge agreed to the defense motion and threw it out, Ferreira would walk. It was for that reason that the decision was made to offer him a deal. Had he been convicted on the second-degree murder charge, Jose Ferreira would have been looking at 20 years behind bars. He would have been in his 70s by the time he walked free. But now that charge was off the table. Ferreira was offered the chance to plead only to attempted second-degree sexual assault and to false imprisonment. That carried a maximum 7-year prison term. He would have been a fool to turn it down. For the violent death of a 13-year-old child, for hiding her body and putting her family through months of anguish, for 3 decades of keeping his deadly secret, leaving them to wonder if they'd ever see justice done for their murdered daughter, Jose Ferreira was sentenced to just 7 years behind bars. "I can't take back how it happened," Ferreira told Carrie Ann's parents before sentence was passed. "Sorry. From the deepest pain in my heart, sorry." For Carrie Ann's mom, Carolyn Toussaint, that pathetic apology and the paltry sentence that accompanies it will have to be enough. However, Carolyn takes solace in the fact that Ferreira did not rest easy all these years. "The cops didn't solve this crime," she says. "Carrie Ann did." She firmly believes that her daughter's spirit was haunting Ferreira, forcing him eventually into his confession. The Drifter. The item was just what Wendy Jo Hallison had been looking for, and it was on sale. The 22-year-old art student had been planning to replace her faulty hairdryer for some time. Now, here was this ad in the Sunday paper, offering one at a knockdown price. It was too good to turn down. After calling her older sister, Linda, and asking if she wanted to take a drive with her, Linda said no. She was spending quality time with her young sons. Wendy Jo departed for the Thrifty on Fairfax Avenue. She was driving her prized mint green Thunderbird. After making her purchase, she was seen filling the car at a gas station. After that, Wendy Jo Hallison disappeared. Wendy Jo was an unfailingly reliable young woman. So when she failed to return home on that September afternoon, Her family was immediately concerned. By evening, her parents were frantic. When a round of phone calls to friends and family failed to turn up any trace of Wendy Jo, they called the police to report her missing. Told that they'd have to wait 48 hours, the Hallisons turned instead to Gil Court, who was married to Wendy Jo's sister. Gil was a private investigator. He soon rallied a bunch of his colleagues and launched a search. They would not find Wendy Jo that night. By the following morning, Monday, October 1st, 1968, Wendy Jo remained missing. The searchers needed to up their game, and so Gil hired a helicopter and sent it to scour the neighborhood from above. Wendy Jo's boyfriend was in the co-pilot seat, and it was he who spotted the Thunderbird parked at the curb on Fairfax. The searchers on the ground were then directed to the vehicle, and it was Gil Court who got there first. A quick search turned up the car keys, lying on the floor by the back seat. These he used to open the trunk. Wendy Jo Hallison's body was crammed inside. Wendy Jo Hallison had met a dreadful end, raped and then asphyxiated with a piece of rope that was tightened around her neck. Judging by her broken fingernails, she'd put up a desperate fight for her life. It had not been enough. Overpowered by a stronger opponent, she had the breath slowly wrenched from her body. The rope that had been used to end her life was lying in the trunk beside her. Wendy Jo's watch was still on her wrist. Her necklace, miraculously unbroken, still adorned her badly bruised neck. The killer had left these behind. He had, however, taken her new hairdryer. Here's a thing that Hollywood movies and detective fiction don't tell you. Murder is most often an easy crime to solve. In the vast majority of cases, killer and victim are connected, sometimes even related. Stranger killings are the exception rather than the norm. Homicide investigators know this, and so they will always look first to the victim's inner circle for potential suspects. In this case, they zeroed in on 4 men: Wendy Jo's boyfriend, a former boyfriend, a family friend, and her brother-in-law, Gil Court. All of the men were asked to submit a polygraph test and agreed. One of them, the boyfriend, failed and was elevated to the top of the suspect list. Subsequent inquiries would clear him. With the other suspects also eliminated, the list now stood as 0. In truth, this was one of those frustrating investigations that never really got off the ground. Wendy Jo had been snatched from a busy suburban area in broad daylight. Someone should have seen something, and yet no one had. Other than reports of a white male seen lurking near the gas station, there was nothing. Forensics were also at a premium. The police had blood and semen. What they didn't have was a suspect to match it to. They also did not have any fingerprints. In those pre-DNA days, that was a death knell to an investigation. Over the years and decades that followed, Wendy Jo's death continued to devastate her family. Her absence was particularly hard on her dad, Lee. He and his daughter shared a birthday, and now each one of those that passed was a reminder of the void she'd left behind. And then there were the other milestones that Wendy would never mark: her wedding, anniversaries, having children of her own, and watching them grow up. Particularly galling to Lee was the fact that Wendy Jo's killer was still out there, that he'd never been held to account. Over the years, the grieving father would stop off regularly at his local police station, asking if there were any new leads. The answer was always no. Lee also put up rewards for information. These came to nothing. Gradually, a demoralizing truth began to dawn on him. He would probably die without seeing his daughter's killer caught. In the final years of his life, Lee would often call his daughter Linda aside and make her promise that she would never give up the fight to see justice done. He would pass away without knowing who'd killed his little girl. So too would Wendy Jo's mother. Fast forward to 1998, and the killer of Wendy Jo Hallison remained a phantom, the clues to his identity frustratingly out of reach. Given the time that had elapsed, investigators knew that he might well be dead, if not incarcerated on some other charge. Still, they were not giving up on the case just yet. DNA fingerprinting had by now entered the picture. Still in its infancy, this technology was fast becoming a cornerstone of forensic investigation. Dozens, if not hundreds, of criminals had already been brought to book. All that was needed was a biological sample from the suspect, and, in the Hallison case, the police had that. Semen had been lifted from the victim's slacks and underwear. Maybe that would yield a match. The first step was for investigators to test their 4 original suspects, and so the men were each asked to provide a blood sample. It was no real surprise when none of the comparisons yielded a match. Next, the sample was run through the fledgling state and national DNA databases in the hope of obtaining a hit there. Unfortunately, this was not successful. The sample was too small and too degraded. The technology of the day was simply not up to the task. But things were moving fast. In 2001, the LAPD established its first cold case squad, assigning 8 highly experienced detectives to the unit. Meanwhile, DNA testing was advancing at an exponential rate. By 2016, it had reached the point where even minuscule quantities could be tested and might yield a result. It was time to revisit the Hallison case file, time to resubmit that DNA. This time, there was a hit. The man who had raped and murdered Wendy Jo Hallison wasn't someone she'd known. He was a stranger to her. In fact, he was a suspected serial killer. Edwin Dean Richardson had been a criminal almost from the time he could walk. As a child, he'd been arrested numerous times, usually for theft and burglary. As a teen, he'd started drifting, moving from state to state, taking menial work where he could find it, more often sustaining himself through petty crime. His criminal activities had also turned violent by now. In 1960, he landed in prison for an attempted robbery and kidnapping in San Diego and spent 8 years behind bars. He was paroled in April 1968. Just 5 months later, he would encounter Wendy Jo Hallison on a pleasant Sunday afternoon in Los Angeles. Wendy Jo was probably not the first young woman to die at Richardson's hands, and she certainly wasn't the last. Eventually apprehended in 1981, the drifter was convicted of killing 21-year-old Joanna Bugner in Belmont County, Ohio. At that time, he was also wanted for the kidnapping of 2 teens just across the state line in West Virginia. He would later be linked by DNA to the 1972 murder of 23-year-old Marla Jean Hires. The unfortunate woman was raped and then strangled and battered to death. Richardson then threw her body down an embankment near the Yorba Linda Country Club. He would plead guilty to that crime in 2006, landing him a life sentence. Richardson was 70 years old at that time and suffering from emphysema. He died behind bars 4 years later, 6 years before he was eventually identified as the killer of Wendy Jo Hallison. Just how many young women met a horrible end at the hands of Edwin Dean Richardson remains a mystery. Given the time he was at large and his habit of drifting from place to place, it is likely to be much higher than the 3 we know about. One death that he was almost certainly responsible for was that of Margie Schuett. The 22-year-old former beauty queen was killed in 1969, a year after Wendy Jo Hallison. Her strangled, battered corpse was discovered in Burbank, but her car was found in Los Angeles, in the parking lot of a thrifty drugstore. This was the same thrifty that Wendy Jo visited on the day she was killed. Given what we know about the modus operandi serial killers, this is too much of a coincidence to be ignored. More than likely, Richardson was taunting the authorities. The murder of Wendy Jo Hallison remains one of the coldest of cold cases to be solved in the United States. 48 years had passed by the time Linda Court Trocino finally got the news she'd been waiting to hear. Her sister's killer had been identified. Linda had kept her promise to her father and seen it through to the end. Edwin Dean Richardson will never stand trial for the murder, but we know who he is. We know the monstrous things he's done. Both Wendy Jo and Lee can rest in peace now. Chew on that. Nova Welsh was missing, and there was no doubt among the people who knew her that she had come to harm. There was no other circumstance under which the devoted young mother would ever have abandoned her two young boys. Those in Nova's circle also had a theory as to what might have happened to her. She'd recently ended an abusive relationship with the father of her children, a 24-year-old construction worker named Osmond Bell. There was a new man in her life now, and it was no secret that Bell was jealous. If anyone had a motive to harm Nova, it was he. In fact, Bell had already threatened to kill his former partner, and he'd put hands on her, choking her until she nearly blacked out. That incident had occurred in July 1981, in the kitchen of the tower block apartment that the couple had shared in Birmingham, England. Now, nearly a month later, the police were searching that same apartment, looking for clues to the missing woman's whereabouts. It was a letter that had brought them here, an anonymous letter that had been sent to a friend of Nova's and then passed on to the authorities. According to the author of this missive, Nova Welsh was dead, murdered by the man she was currently dating. This man was questioned, of course, but denied harming Nova and was allowed to leave. Also brought in for questioning was Osmond Bell, who was equally vociferous in his denials. According to Bell, the stories about his jealous rants were vastly overstated. He was done with Nova, and good riddance. He hadn't seen her in over a month. With no reasonable cause to detain him, the police let him go. Nova Welsh had now been missing for 3 weeks, and her family and friends were beside themselves with worry. Particularly distressed were Nova's sons, the oldest of whom was just 6 years of age. They wanted to know where their mommy was, and the West Midlands police were determined to answer that question for them. Officers descended on the Welsh's apartment, going through everything with a veritable fine-toothed comb, looking for something, anything that might point to her whereabouts. Those efforts, thorough though they were, would come up empty. It was only when the search was expanded to the communal areas of the complex that the mystery was resolved. It was an odd smell emanating from an electrical utility closet that drew the searchers' attention. The closet had a busted lock, and someone had jammed a wad of chewing gum into the gap to secure the door in place. Opening it, an officer was immediately driven back by a gust of foul air that emanated from within. When he stepped forward again, he was armed with a flashlight, which he directed into the dark space. There, in the deepest reaches of the closet, he spotted something, a humanoid form huddled in the darkness. It took him less than a second to realize what he was looking at. Nova Welsh had been found. There was no doubt at all that Nova had come to a violent end. The autopsy would confirm this. The mother of two had been strangled. That left the police with several suspects, all of them men who the murdered woman had dated. Heading the list was the jealous ex, Osmond Bell. He had, after all, threatened publicly to kill the victim and had throttled her in the past. How much of a stretch was it to believe that he'd given in to his rage at their failed relationship, that he'd taken things too far? Osmond Bell was hauled in for questioning, subjected to what he'd later describe as a dark and terrible 4-day interrogation. But if the police were hoping to cower him into a confession, they would fail dismally. Through it all, Bell maintained his composure, never once giving the impression that he was about to crack. He suggested that the police check out Nova's latest boyfriend instead, the same man who had been mentioned in the anonymous letter. The truth was that the police had nothing on Bell. Motive and opportunity, yes, but no case has ever been closed based on motive and opportunity alone. Evidence is the oxygen that sustains an investigation, and the police had none, aside from the anonymous letter. Considerable effort had been expended on finding the writer of the letter, since the person who'd written it clearly had foreknowledge of the crime. The penmanship, according to an expert, pointed to a female scribe. Whoever she was, she'd been careful. The only fingerprints found on the paper were accounted for. They belonged to the letter's recipient. Whatever promise this piece of evidence might have held, it got investigators no closer to a resolution. And so, the mysterious letter and its envelope, the wad of gum from the closet, and the other paltry clues were bagged and catalogued. Detectives were assigned to more solvable matters, and Nova Welsh's file ended up among the cold cases, most of which no one ever expected to be resolved. But for the advent of DNA profiling, that would almost certainly have been true. DNA, however, changed everything. In 2016, a cold case team of the West Midlands Police decided to have another crack at the Welsh murder. The case was a good candidate, since there were two probable sources of biological matter: the sticky strip of the envelope that had contained the anonymous letter, and the wad of chewing gum used to secure the utility closet. Both items were tested, and both gave up a sample. DNA profiles were then extracted. To no one's surprise, they were from the same donor. The individual who had left the gum on the closet was the same person who'd licked the envelope. Despite the letter being written by a female, this person was clearly male. Now, all the police had to do was find him. They had a good idea where to start looking. 36 years had passed since the murder of Nova Welsh. The chief suspect in the case, Osmond Bell, had been 24 years old at the time. Now he was 60. During the intervening years, Bell had lived what his lawyer would later describe as an exemplary life. Surely, such an upstanding citizen would have no problem providing a saliva sample to clear up a decades-old case. Surely he'd want closure for his now-adult children? Bell was approached to provide a biological sample and agreed. How could he do otherwise? His DNA profile was then compared to that from the evidence and returned a match. Finally, after nearly 4 decades, the identity of Nova Welsh's killer had been confirmed. Or had it? At the subsequent trial, held at the Birmingham Crown Court in March 2017, Bell's defense team offered an interesting hypothesis. According to his lawyer, Bell's DNA was only on the letter because the police had handed it to him during his initial interrogation. As for the gum, he could have stuck it on the door at any time. He had, after all, lived in the building for several years. Unfortunately for the defense, these arguments do not hold up to scrutiny. Bell's DNA wasn't just on the letter. It was on the sticky strip of the envelope, left there when he'd licked the strip to seal it. The gum was even more damning. It was undisturbed when the police found it. The person who'd left it there had done so while sealing Nova Welsh inside. There was no possibility that person could have been anyone other than Osmond Bell, not according to the DNA. In spite of this damning evidence, Osmond Bell would not be convicted of murder. After an entire week of agonizing over a decision, the jury decided that Nova had been killed during an argument that got out of hand. There was no evidence of premeditation, and therefore the appropriate charge was manslaughter, not murder. This verdict was reached by an 11-1 majority. Bell was then sentenced to 12 years, of which 6 would be spent behind bars, 6 on probation. It seems a paltry price to pay for such a vicious killing. Escape plan. Imagine the scene. You're a recently married young man, working a night shift at a paper mill in a small Midwestern town. You have a young wife at home and a baby son, just 3 months old. You arrive home one morning, exhausted from your night's work, ready to hit the shower and then hit the hay. As you approach the house, you notice something amiss. Your dog is outside, chained to a porch post. He seems nervous, barking and whimpering. Your wife loves that dog. She'd never leave him tied up outside like that overnight. Instinctively, you know that something is wrong. You enter the silent house. You feel the hackles rise on the back of your neck. This was exactly the scene that 23-year-old Lane McIntyre faced on the morning of March 11th, 1980. Lane had just returned to his home in Columbus, Wisconsin, when he was confronted with the aforementioned scenario: the chained dog, the silent house, the feeling of dread that engulfed him. And in this case, that trepidation was warranted. Just inside the front door lay his 18-year-old wife, Marilyn, quite obviously dead, a steak knife sticking out of her chest. Lane had barely a moment to process this bloody scene when a panicked thought flashed through his mind. His son, Christopher. In the next moment, he was running, sprinting down the corridor to the baby's bedroom. Christopher was in his crib, sound asleep. Scooping the child up, Lane went for the phone and called his parents. They listened to his babbled, tearful, barely coherent telling, and then dialed the police. To the officers who responded to that call, a few things were immediately obvious. The first was that there were no signs of a break-in. Marilyn McIntyre had apparently let her killer into the residence, suggesting that it was someone she knew. The second was that the killer had not just stabbed Marilyn, he'd beaten and strangled her. That level of violence, again, pointed to someone with a personal relationship, most probably someone with a considerable level of animosity towards the victim. But who might that person be? Everyone who knew Marilyn said that she was a friendly, easygoing person without an enemy in the world. The first suspect, as it almost always is in these cases, was the grieving husband. Lane, of course, had an alibi. He'd been at the mill all night. Based on the testimony of a neighbor who said that she'd woken around 3 a.m. after the dog was put outside and started barking, the police had an estimate of when the murder occurred. Lane's time card suggested that he'd been at work at that time. But as detectives began delving a little deeper, they learned that the alibi wasn't quite as watertight as it appeared. Lane had worked alone that night, and he was allowed to take breaks without clocking out. That meant that he could have left the plant during his shift without anyone knowing about it. Aside from that, the police learned that he had a financial motive. Just days before Marilyn's death, he'd taken out a policy on her life. Lane McIntyre might have had motive and opportunity, but that didn't make him a wife killer. The police did not have a shred of evidence against him. Besides, everyone they talked to told them that Lane loved Marilyn and would never have harmed her. Instead, friends and family suggested another suspect, a friend of the couple named Curtis Forbes. According to sources, Forbes was furious with Marilyn for encouraging his girlfriend, Deborah Adelson, to break up with him. Brought in for questioning, Curtis Forbes admitted that he'd been angry with Marilyn for meddling in his relationship, but he denied harming her. "That's not how I roll," he assured investigators. He then went on to offer an alibi. According to Forbes, he'd been drinking at a bar that night. He'd left at closing time and had then gone to visit a friend named Lori Beatty. Beatty and her boyfriend confirmed that Forbes had shown up on their doorstep at around 1 a.m. He hadn't stayed long, though. Finding that they had no beer, he offered to go out and buy some. he'd never returned. That, of course, would have given him plenty of time to drive to the McIntyre residence and kill Marilyn. Confronted with this, Forbes admitted that it was true, but said that he hadn't returned to Laurie's apartment because he had decided to visit his girlfriend, Deborah Adelson, instead. That was where he'd spent the rest of the night. The police, of course, checked out this latest amendment to the alibi, and they soon learned that it was flawed. Forbes had indeed visited his girlfriend in the early morning hours, but he'd only arrived at her house around 4 a.m. That left 3 hours unaccounted for, 3 hours which just happened to coincide with the time of Marilyn McIntyre's murder. It was time to bring in Curtis Forbes for another round of questioning. However, when the police went to find him, they learned that Forbes had quit town. This was not a good look for a man suspected of murder. On the other hand, Forbes was a carpenter who sometimes worked on construction projects out of state. His sudden disappearance might have an entirely innocent explanation. Besides, what did the police have on him, really? Forbes had a flawed alibi. That didn't make him a killer. And so, Marilyn McIntyre was laid to rest, and the inquiry into her violent death gradually ground to a halt for lack of evidence. Lane McIntyre continued to be regarded by most locals as the likely killer, and even his son, Christopher, became estranged from him over those suspicions. Over the years that followed, Marilyn's family continued to call the Columbus police from time to time, asking if there were any new leads in the case. The answer was always the same. Fate is a fickle thing. Sometimes the smallest actions can have major consequences, either good or bad. In 2007, Marilyn McIntyre's niece decided to call for an update on her aunt's case. Her intention was to dial the Columbus Police Department, who had jurisdiction. Mistakenly, she called the Columbia County Sheriff's Office. The detective she spoke to had never heard of the McIntyre case, but was nonetheless intrigued. He vowed to look into the matter, certain that there must be blood evidence in such a violent death. And if that was the case, then DNA might unmask the killer. Things would not turn out to be quite as straightforward as that, though. Blood had been retrieved from the bathroom sink at the crime scene, and it returned 2 DNA profiles when submitted for testing. One was from Marilyn. The other was from the person who was likely her killer. When no match was found in CODIS, the cops asked Lane McIntyre to provide a sample, which he immediately did. It wasn't him. After 27 years of suspicion, innuendo, and outright accusations, Lane had been officially cleared of his wife's murder. With Lane out of the picture, the focus now shifted to the only other suspect the police had considered, Curtis Forbes. Soon, they'd uncover a startling detail that had not come to light at the time of the original inquiry. On the morning that Marilyn McIntyre died, Forbes had handed his girlfriend a bloodied shirt and asked her to wash it. The presence of blood in the bathroom and on Forbes's shirt suggested that, if he was indeed Marilyn's killer, he might have suffered an injury while attacking her. Most likely, that injury would have been inflicted by the victim's nails. The decision was therefore taken to exhume Marilyn's corpse, to see if skin cells could be retrieved from under her fingernails. Such evidence would have made the case, but the results would prove disappointing. After 27 years in the ground, the biological material was unusable. But that is not to say that the exhumation was a waste of time. Investigators had decided beforehand that they would use the event to put psychological pressure on their suspect. Columbia County officials had been all over the media, confidently predicting that DNA would be found and that it would close their case. Their hope was that it would spook the killer, and in that regard, it succeeded. As detectives kept Forbes under surveillance, they found that he was making plans to pull another of his disappearing acts. It turned out that Forbes had recently been in touch with a carpenters' union in Hawaii, scouting for work there. He'd also been checking out inflatable rafts and was inquiring about chartering a fishing boat. Investigators believed that he planned on taking the boat out on Lake Michigan and sinking it, faking his death. He'd then take the raft to shore and abscond to a new life in the sun. Unfortunately for Forbes, he was arrested before he could pull off his audacious escape plan. Curtis Forbes went on trial in November 2010, 30 years on from the murder of Marilyn McIntyre. He entered a plea of not guilty, but the case against him was strong. Aside from his DNA on the bathroom sink, there was the testimony of his girlfriend, Deborah Adelson, who told the court about the bloody shirt he'd handed her on the morning of the murder. There were also witnesses who testified that Forbes had tried to pick up several women at the bar that night and had been rebuffed every time. The prosecution theory was that he'd eventually decided to visit Marilyn, who he knew would be home alone. Whether he intended to sexually assault the young mother or to kill her in revenge for turning his girlfriend against him, the outcome was the same. Marilyn had ended up dead. In the end, it took the jury just 3 hours to convict Curtis Forbes of first-degree murder. Forbes was sentenced to life in prison. He won't be sipping cocktails on Waikiki Beach anytime soon. When the Music's Over. Christy Mirak was living her dream, doing a job she loved. Christy was a 6th-grade teacher at Rohrerstown Elementary School in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and this wasn't just a job to Christy. It was her passion. The 21-year-old was devoted to her class and was loved by them in return. With Christmas approaching, she'd bought every child in the group a book, which she'd carefully gift-wrapped. She was planning on handing these out during first period on Monday, December 21st, 1992. But as the first bell chimed that day, Christy was nowhere to be seen. This worried school principal Harry Goodman, who knew her to be a punctual and reliable person. He could not imagine that she'd miss a day without at least calling in. Yet she'd done just that, and now she wasn't even answering her phone. After mulling the situation for a while, Principal Goodman decided to drive to Christy's apartment at the Greenfield Estates complex to check on her. There, he found the door standing slightly ajar, and no answer when he knocked. Tentatively, Goodman eased it open, calling Christy's name as he did so. Then he stepped inside. Moments later, the principal came staggering back out into the hallway, the blood drained from his face, his breathing labored, a hand to his chest. He walked to a neighbor's door and knocked. The person who answered thought he was having a heart attack. Except it wasn't Principal Goodman who was afflicted. It was Christy Mirak. Officers who responded to the call found the once pretty blonde lying on the floor, fully dressed in her coat and gloves, her skirt pushed up, and her undergarments removed. Christy had been beaten to death, the attack so brutal that it had turned her face into a bloodied, misshapen mess, barely recognizable as human. The weapon that had inflicted these terrible injuries was lying beside the corpse, a wooden cutting block. Judging by the evidence found at the scene, the overturned furniture, and scattered Christmas presents, Christy Mirak had put up quite a fight. Ultimately, though, she'd been no match for her killer. An autopsy would later reveal that the young woman had been raped. Bruising to the throat and damage to the hyoid bone indicated that she had also been strangled. The police had 2 theories as to how this brutal crime might have been committed. The first was that Christy Mirak had known her killer and had let him into the apartment. This made sense, since there was no sign of forced entry, and Christy was known to be a security-conscious person. The other possibility was that she'd been ambushed as she was about to leave for work. This, too, could be made to gel with the evidence. Christy had a roommate, Mary Lesko, who had departed just after 7 a.m. that day. Christie usually left around 7:45 a.m. Since she'd been found wearing her coat and gloves, it was surmised that the killer had been waiting when she'd opened the door, had forced her back inside, and subdued her with a hand on her throat. He'd then taken what he wanted before beating her to death with the cutting board. But who might have done such a thing? At first, the police focused on suspects who had known the murdered woman. Principal Goodman, still traumatized by the discovery of the body, was briefly considered a suspect, but soon eliminated from the inquiry. The investigators switched their attention to a man Christie had recently dated, a married man, 20 years her senior. He, too, was eliminated since his DNA did not match the semen found at the crime scene. After that, the police cast a wider net, interviewing and polygraphing dozens of suspects. All of them were ultimately cleared. One interesting clue to emerge during the early stages of the investigation was an eyewitness report of a man seen lurking around Christie's building on the day of the murder. The man was described as late 20s, muscular build, long medium brown hair, clean-shaven, with deep-set eyes. According to the witness, he'd driven up to the building in a mid-sized white car, possibly a Dodge Shadow, a Dodge ES, or a Toyota. He'd parked his vehicle in the overflow parking lot across the street and then walked toward the entrance of Christie's building. This was around 7 a.m. As tenuous as this clue seemed, the police took it seriously, announcing via the media that this man was a person of interest. In truth, this was nothing more than a shot in the dark. The police did not have a single viable suspect, and the leads they were chasing were leading them away from the killer, not towards him. A profile had now been developed, describing the suspect as a shy loner who kept mostly to himself and would not stand out in a crowd. This would turn out to be almost the opposite of the man they were hunting. By 1995, the Lancaster police had interviewed over 1,500 people, of which as many as 60 were considered suspects. Every one of these men was ultimately eliminated by DNA. The suspect's DNA had also been submitted to the state database, but had found no match there. Despite assurances by the police that the case had not been mothballed, the investigation was in trouble. There would be very little progress over the next 8 years. Then, in 2003, there was an odd twist. A man called the Lancaster Sunday News and spoke to a reporter, saying that he wanted to pitch a story idea. He suggested that the paper should run a piece about women who are secretly promiscuous and lead a double life that no one knows about. One of the names he mentioned was Chandra Levy, the Washington, D.C. intern whose skeletal remains had been found in May of that year. Another was Christie Mirak. Asked to elaborate, the man said that he knew about a barn on Christie's parents' property where she used to bring men for sex. "I'm not saying she deserved to die," he concluded, "but what did she expect?" The reporter, of course, passed on this information to the police. They, in turn, reached out to the FBI for assistance. A criminal profiler was consulted and suggested that the caller was likely Christie Mirak's killer. Unfortunately, there was no way to trace the call, and the man never called again. The police did carry out some fact-checking, though. There was no barn on the Mirak property. 14 years passed, a period during which DNA technology made truly mind-boggling advances. It was now possible to extract a profile from even a microscopic smidge of biological material. And even if that material was considerably degraded, it was often still viable. Cold cases were being resolved up and down the country, but regrettably, Christie Mirak's murder was not one of them. While the Lancaster police continued to submit their profile to the CODIS database at regular intervals, it invariably returned the same result: no match. Still, there were other uses that the profile could be put to. In 2017, the police submitted their sample to Parabon Nanolabs, a forerunner in DNA processing. The company had recently developed a technology that could create an identikit of the person based only on their DNA. In fact, they could go one better. The images they produced showed what the suspect would look like age 25, 45, and 55. These were released to the media in the hope that someone would recognize the individual and come forward. Plenty of leads were generated. None of them panned out. It is necessary at this point in the story to take a brief detour back to 2010 when a company called GED Match was founded. The company's goal was to provide assistance to amateur and professional genealogists, giving them a tool to track down familial links. That tool is a large and growing DNA database. Someone wanting to use the platform simply needs to obtain their DNA profile via a company like 23andMe. They upload the profile onto GED Match and can then view and compare their own information against the entire archive. Since the database is public, anyone can use it, including law enforcement. In 2018, the Mirac profile was entered into the GED Match database and run against almost 1.5 million users. Almost immediately, it returned a partial match. Investigators then started looking into the background of the person they'd identified and found that he had a half-brother, an individual who had lived his entire life in Lancaster, but had never appeared on their radar as a suspect. This man, in fact, was a bit of a local celebrity. He was a DJ who'd once been the resident disc spinner at a popular local night spot named Chameleon. He was also in high demand for weddings, proms, and the like. His name was Raymond Rowe, more commonly known to his public as DJ Freeze. Checking into Rowe's background, police learned that he was a high school dropout, 4 times married, with a reputation as a ladies' man. He bore an uncanny resemblance to the pictures developed by Parabon Nanolabs and also matched the description of the man seen near Christy Mirac's apartment on the day she was killed. Moreover, investigators learned from a 1991 speeding ticket that he had driven a white Toyota Coupe back then, a vehicle that matched the one described by eyewitnesses. But if Raymond Rowe was the killer of Christy Mirac, then the murder was a one-off. Aside from a few traffic violations and a single arrest for disorderly conduct, his record was clean. There was one way to know for sure if he was the man the police had been hunting all these years. When DJ Freeze played his next gig, undercover officers were in attendance. When they observed him discarding a water bottle and a wad of chewing gum, they swooped in to retrieve these items. Submitted for testing, they delivered the news that investigators had been waiting to hear for 25 years. It was a match. Raymond Rowe was arrested and charged with Christy Mirac's murder on June 25, 2018. In the intervening years, Rowe had become a born-again Christian. However, he showed very little Christian compassion at his trial. With Christy's family desperate for answers, he refused to speak, refused to say how or why she died, refused to offer them any relief. All he would say was that he had killed her and that he was sorry. It was left to the prosecution to speculate as to what might have happened in Christy's apartment that morning. Whether or not Rowe and Christy knew each other is open to conjecture. What is almost certain is that they must have encountered each other at some time before the murder. Lancaster is a small town with a limited after-hours scene. Christy was a young woman who liked to go dancing with her friends. She would almost certainly have found her way to Chameleon, the most popular club in town, the club where Rowe was the resident DJ. We know that she did because a pass from the club was found in her apartment. Did Rowe spot her there? Did he make a play for her? Was he rejected? Did he follow her home to take what he wanted? Did he beat her to death to stop her from talking? Since Raymond Rowe refuses to answer, we will never know the answers to these questions. All we know is that a beloved daughter and sister, a much-loved teacher, was beaten to death. Rowe was responsible for that and lived with his deadly secret for 25 years. But it is becoming more and more difficult for killers to get away with their misdeeds. Murder has no statute of limitations, and technology stands still for no man. Raymond Rowe found that out the hard way. He will spend the rest of his life behind bars.